Welcome to Sleep Teacher. Tonight, we're starting something special. 100 unwritten rules of human nature that silently shape every interaction we have. Why do we automatically mirror someone's body language? Why do emotions spread between people like invisible waves? These aren't rules anyone teaches us, but they're more powerful than any written law. Over the next few episodes, we'll explore the fascinating psychology behind how we form relationships, make decisions, and navigate our social world. Each segment is designed to be educational and deeply relaxing, perfect for learning while your mind prepares for sleep. If you enjoy discovering these hidden patterns of human behavior, please hit that like button and subscribe for more peaceful learning experiences. And comment below, which psychological principle do you think influences your daily life the most? Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's explore the first unwritten rule of human nature. Human relationships operate on an invisible system of exchange that governs nearly every social interaction we have. When someone does us a favor, buys us coffee, or offers help, we feel an almost magnetic pull to return the gesture. This isn't mere politeness or learned behavior. It's a fundamental psychological principle that emerges from millions of years of evolution, where cooperation and mutual aid meant the difference between survival and extinction. The reciprocity principle operates like an unconscious ledger in our minds, carefully tracking what we give and what we receive from others. Research shows that this system of social exchange creates the foundation for trust, friendship, and community bonds that hold societies together. We feel genuine discomfort when relationships become unbalanced, either because we've received too much without giving back, or because we've given more than we've received. This explains why people often feel awkward accepting gifts, why unbalanced friendships create tension, and why the simple act of sharing creates connection. The principle works so powerfully that marketing experts use it to influence consumer behavior, and therapists use it to help couples understand relationship dynamics. Understanding reciprocity helps us build stronger relationships by being conscious of our giving and receiving patterns, ensuring that our connections remain healthy and mutually beneficial over time. In moments of uncertainty, our brains automatically scan the environment for clues about appropriate behavior, and the most powerful clue comes from observing what other people are doing. This psychological shortcut, called social proof, operates as a mental efficiency system that helps us navigate complex social situations without having to analyze every detail independently. When we see a long line at a restaurant, we assume the food must be good. When we notice others looking up at the sky, we automatically look up too. When we're unsure how to dress for an event, we observe what others are wearing. This isn't weakness or lack of independent thinking. It's an adaptive strategy that usually leads to appropriate choices while conserving mental energy. Solomon Asch's famous experiments demonstrated that people will conform to group judgment even when the group is obviously wrong, revealing how powerfully social proof influences our perceptions and decisions. Modern research shows that social proof affects everything from charitable donations to environmental behavior, with people being much more likely to act when told that others like them are already doing so. The principle becomes even stronger when we identify with the group providing the social proof, which is why testimonials from similar people are so persuasive. Understanding social proof helps us recognize when we're being influenced by others and make more conscious choices about when to follow the crowd versus when to trust our own judgment and values. Each person moves through the world surrounded by an invisible boundary of personal space that varies depending on relationships, culture, and context. This psychological territory, studied extensively by anthropologist Edward T. Hall, consists of distinct zones that trigger different emotional responses when entered by others. The intimate zone, extending about 18 inches from our bodies, is reserved for close family members and romantic partners. The personal zone, reaching about 4 feet, is for friends and familiar acquaintances. The social zone, extending to about 12 feet, is appropriate for casual interactions and business meetings. Beyond that lies the public zone, used for formal presentations and large group interactions. These boundaries aren't arbitrary social conventions, but deeply rooted psychological needs that, when violated, activate our threat detection systems and create discomfort or anxiety. Different cultures have varying standards for personal space, with some maintaining larger bubbles than others, leading to misunderstandings when people from different backgrounds interact. Understanding personal space helps explain why elevator rides feel uncomfortable, why standing too close during conversation creates tension, and why people feel invaded when someone sits too close on an empty bus. Respecting these invisible boundaries demonstrates social awareness and consideration for others' psychological comfort. Learning to read and honor personal space cues helps us build rapport while avoiding unintentional discomfort, making our interactions more pleasant and effective for everyone involved. Human emotions are surprisingly contagious, spreading from person to person through unconscious mimicry and synchronization that happens faster than conscious thought. This phenomenon, known as emotional contagion, occurs through our mirror neuron systems, which automatically activate when we observe others' actions, expressions, and emotional states. When someone smiles at us, we tend to smile back without thinking. When we're around anxious people, we often start feeling anxious ourselves. When we hear genuine laughter, we feel happier even if we don't know what's funny. This emotional synchronization happens through subtle cues like facial expressions, body posture, vocal tones, and breathing patterns that our brains process and mirror automatically. Research shows that people in close relationships begin to match each other's emotional patterns over time, while teams and families develop shared emotional climates that affect everyone's well-being and performance. The person who can maintain emotional stability often becomes an emotional anchor for others, while someone in a negative emotional state can drag down an entire group's mood and energy. This principle explains why we yawn when others yawn, why spending time with positive people lifts our spirits, and why toxic relationships feel so draining. Understanding emotional contagion helps us become more conscious of the emotional climate we create and more intentional about choosing our emotional influences. It also reminds us that our emotional state affects not just ourselves but ripples outward to impact everyone around us in ways we might not even realize. Within minutes of meeting strangers, humans begin unconsciously assessing and establishing social hierarchies based on perceived status, competence, and dominance. This automatic process involves evaluating subtle cues like body language, voice tone, clothing, confidence level, and social signals that indicate where each person might fit in the group's pecking order. These status assessments happen so quickly and unconsciously that most people aren't aware they're making them, yet they profoundly influence who speaks first in meetings, whose opinions carry more weight, and how group dynamics unfold. Research identifies two primary paths to status: dominance, achieved through intimidation or force, and prestige, gained through demonstrated competence and respect. While dominance might create temporary authority, prestige tends to generate longer-lasting influence and genuine respect from others. Status hierarchies aren't necessarily fair or accurate reflections of people's actual abilities or worth, but they emerge naturally, even in supposedly egalitarian environments. Understanding these dynamics helps explain workplace politics, why some people naturally emerge as leaders while others follow, and how group influence patterns develop. The key insight is that while status hierarchies are natural and probably unavoidable, we can choose whether to pursue status through dominance or prestige, and we can work to create more inclusive environments that recognize and value diverse forms of contribution and intelligence rather than defaulting to traditional power markers. The human brain is wired to experience losses as approximately twice as painful as equivalent gains are pleasurable, a psychological principle that profoundly shapes how we make decisions and evaluate risks. This loss aversion bias means that losing $100 feels much worse than gaining $100 feels good, creating an automatic preference for avoiding losses over acquiring equivalent gains. The principle operates through our brain's ancient threat detection system, where potential losses trigger immediate attention and defensive responses designed to protect us from harm. This evolutionary adaptation helped our ancestors survive by being extra cautious about losing resources essential for survival, but in modern environments it can lead to overly conservative decision-making and resistance to beneficial changes. Loss aversion explains why people often stick with unsatisfactory situations rather than risk change, why we hold on to failing investments longer than winning ones, and why marketing messages about what we might lose are often more persuasive than messages about what we might gain. The bias also affects our perception of fairness and value, making us more sensitive to price increases than price decreases, and more upset about service failures than we are pleased about service improvements. Understanding loss aversion helps us recognize when fear of loss might be preventing us from making beneficial changes or taking reasonable risks. It also reminds us to frame decisions and communications in ways that acknowledge people's natural sensitivity to potential losses while helping them see the bigger picture of potential gains. Extensive research by relationship expert John Gottman has revealed that successful relationships of all types require approximately 5 positive interactions for every negative one to maintain satisfaction and stability. This remarkable finding applies universally across romantic partnerships, friendships, family dynamics, and workplace relationships, representing a fundamental law of human connection that emerges from how our brains process emotional information. Negative interactions like criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and conflict carry much more psychological weight than positive interactions like appreciation, affection, humor, and support. This happens because our brains evolved to pay more attention to negative information than positive information as a survival mechanism that helped our ancestors avoid danger and threats. In modern relationships, this negativity bias means that a single harsh criticism can overshadow several genuine compliments, and one moment of contempt can undo hours of pleasant interaction. People intuitively track this emotional bank account in their relationships, and when the balance tips too far toward negativity, relationships deteriorate regardless of their history or foundation. The 5-to-1 ratio doesn't mean we should avoid all negative interactions, which are sometimes necessary for growth and problem solving, but rather that we need to consciously create positive interactions to counterbalance the natural impact of negative ones. Understanding this principle helps us invest more intentionally in the relationships that matter most, making deliberate efforts to express appreciation, share positive experiences, and create moments of connection that build up our emotional reserves with others. Beneath the surface of all human connections lies a fundamental question that shapes how we feel about our relationships. Are you there for me when I need you? This attachment principle, drawn from decades of psychological research, reveals that relationship security depends on 3 core elements: accessibility, responsiveness, and emotional engagement. Accessibility means being available when needed, not necessarily physically present at all times, but reachable and approachable when important matters arise. Responsiveness involves actually responding to bids for connection, attention, and support in ways that show care and understanding. Emotional engagement means being present and invested in the relationship, showing that the other person matters to you and that you're genuinely interested in their thoughts, feelings, and experiences. When people feel confident that their important relationships meet these 3 criteria, they can explore the world with security and confidence, knowing they have a safe haven to return to when needed. When these elements are missing or unreliable, people become anxious, demanding, or withdraw emotionally as protective strategies. This pattern governs not only romantic relationships, but also parent-child bonds, friendships, and even professional relationships where trust and reliability matter. The attachment question explains why people get upset when calls aren't returned promptly, why emotional unavailability damages relationships more than physical absence, and why consistent responsiveness builds trust over time. Understanding this principle helps us recognize that beneath most relationship conflicts lies a deeper question about emotional availability and connection that, when addressed, can resolve many surface-level issues. Our minds operate like sophisticated security systems, continuously scanning our environment for potential threats, problems, and negative outcomes that might require our attention or response. This threat detection system, evolved over millions of years, helped our ancestors survive by being hyper-vigilant to dangers like predators, hostile groups, and environmental hazards. In modern environments, this same system remains active, creating what psychologists call a negativity bias that makes us pay more attention to negative information than positive information, remember bad events more vividly than good ones, and assume potential problems even in neutral situations. This vigilance operates automatically and unconsciously, influencing our perceptions, memories, and decisions in ways we rarely notice. The system explains why bad news captures our attention more readily than good news, why we often remember criticism more clearly than praise, and why anxiety about potential problems can overshadow appreciation for current blessings. While this negativity bias can create unnecessary worry and pessimism in safe modern environments, it also serves important protective functions by helping us notice real risks and prepare for genuine challenges. The key is learning to distinguish between helpful vigilance that keeps us safe and unhelpful anxiety that diminishes our quality of life. Understanding our natural negativity bias helps us recognize when our threat detection system might be overactive and reminds us to consciously cultivate positive experiences and perspectives. It also explains why gratitude practices and positive psychology interventions can be so beneficial for mental health and overall well-being. Once individuals make a commitment or take a position, they experience powerful psychological pressure to behave consistently with that choice, especially when the commitment is voluntary, public, and involves effort or sacrifice. This consistency principle operates through our fundamental need to maintain coherent self-concepts and avoid the mental discomfort of cognitive dissonance that occurs when our actions conflict with our stated beliefs or previous decisions. The drive for consistency is so strong that people will often continue with failing projects, relationships, or strategies long after evidence suggests they should change course, simply because changing direction would require admitting their initial commitment was wrong. Research demonstrates that people who write down their commitments are significantly more likely to follow through than those who make only verbal promises, and that small initial commitments often lead to much larger commitments through the psychological momentum of consistency. This pattern influences everything from personal goal achievement to political beliefs to consumer behavior as people work to align their subsequent actions with their earlier choices. Understanding the consistency principle explains why public commitments are more binding than private ones, why salespeople seek small initial agreements before making larger requests, and why effective change strategies often begin with small steps that create momentum toward larger transformations. The principle can be harnessed constructively by making deliberate commitments that align with our values and goals, while also recognizing when consistency might be keeping us stuck in unproductive patterns that no longer serve us well. Human minds operate like sophisticated filtering systems that unconsciously seek out information confirming our existing beliefs while avoiding or dismissing contradictory evidence. This confirmation bias shapes how we interpret news, choose friends, make decisions, and understand the world around us. When we hold a particular viewpoint, our brains automatically highlight supporting evidence while minimizing conflicting information, creating the illusion that our beliefs are more accurate and widely supported than they actually are. This mental shortcut evolved to help us make quick decisions and maintain confidence in uncertain situations, but it can also trap us in echo chambers of our own making. The bias operates so subtly that we rarely notice it happening. We gravitate toward news sources that align with our political views, interpret ambiguous situations in ways that support our preconceptions, and remember details that confirm our initial impressions while forgetting those that challenge them. Social media algorithms amplify this effect by showing us content similar to what we've previously engaged with, creating digital bubbles that reinforce our existing perspectives. Understanding confirmation bias helps us recognize when we might be filtering information selectively and encourages us to actively seek out diverse viewpoints and challenging perspectives. The goal isn't to eliminate all bias, which is impossible, but to become more aware of how our mental filters work so we can make more informed and balanced decisions. Deep within our brains lies a remarkable system of mirror neurons that automatically activate when we observe others' actions, causing us to unconsciously mimic the people around us. This sophisticated mimicry happens so naturally that most people never notice they're doing it, yet it plays a crucial role in building rapport, understanding emotions, and creating social bonds. When someone leans forward during conversation, we tend to lean forward too. When they cross their arms, we often follow suit. When they speak softly, we lower our voices to match. This unconscious copying extends to facial expressions, breathing patterns, speaking rhythms, and even subtle gestures that create a sense of harmony and connection between people. Research shows that this mimicry increases liking, trust, and cooperation between individuals, while also helping us understand others' emotional states through embodied experience. The mirroring becomes more pronounced when we're trying to build relationships or when we find someone attractive or interesting. Skilled communicators and salespeople often use conscious mirroring techniques to create rapport, but the most powerful mimicry happens naturally and unconsciously when people genuinely connect. Understanding mirror neuron mimicry helps explain why we feel comfortable with some people and uncomfortable with others, why group dynamics can shift entire rooms, and why spending time with calm, confident people tends to make us feel more calm and confident ourselves. The key insight is that our behavior influences others just as theirs influences us. When making decisions or judgments, human minds tend to rely heavily on the first piece of information encountered, using it as an anchor that influences all subsequent evaluations. This anchoring effect is so powerful that even random numbers can skew our judgments if presented before we make decisions. Researchers have demonstrated that people asked to consider whether Gandhi lived more or less than 144 years will give higher estimates of his actual age than people first asked whether he lived more or less than 44 years, even though both groups know the anchor numbers are arbitrary. This cognitive bias affects everything from salary negotiations and price evaluations to medical diagnoses and legal judgments. In negotiations, whoever mentions the first number often gains advantage because that figure becomes the reference point around which all other offers revolve. Real estate agents use anchoring by showing overpriced properties first, making subsequent listings seem more reasonable by comparison. The effect persists even when people are warned about it and try to adjust their thinking, demonstrating how deeply embedded this mental shortcut is in our decision-making processes. Understanding anchoring helps us recognize when initial information might be biasing our judgments and reminds us to gather multiple reference points before making important decisions. It also explains why first impressions are so influential and why the order in which we present information can significantly impact how others receive and evaluate it. Being aware of anchoring allows us to use it constructively while protecting ourselves from manipulation. Humans possess an innate tendency to favor members of their own groups while viewing outsiders with suspicion or indifference, a psychological pattern that emerges from our evolutionary history of tribal living. This in-group favoritism operates so automatically that it can be triggered by the most arbitrary group divisions, such as randomly assigned team colors or preferences for abstract art styles. Once we identify with a group, we unconsciously begin to see our fellow members as more trustworthy, competent, and deserving of help while viewing outsiders as less reliable or worthy of consideration. The effect manifests in countless ways throughout daily life, from rooting for sports teams and supporting political parties to preferring job candidates who attended our alma mater or share our hobbies. We interpret ambiguous actions more favorably when performed by in-group members and more suspiciously when performed by outsiders. We remember positive information about our groups more readily than negative information, while doing the opposite for outgroups. This bias extends to resource allocation, with people consistently giving more opportunities, benefits, and second chances to those they perceive as belonging to their tribe. While in-group favoritism can create strong bonds of loyalty and cooperation within communities, it can also fuel discrimination, conflict, and injustice when taken to extremes. Understanding this tendency helps us recognize when group loyalties might be clouding our judgment and encourages us to actively consider the perspectives and needs of those outside our immediate circles. When estimating the likelihood of events or the frequency of occurrences, our minds rely heavily on how easily relevant examples come to memory, a mental shortcut called the availability heuristic. This means that vivid, recent, or personally experienced events seem more probable than they actually are, while less memorable events seem rarer than statistics suggest. People consistently overestimate the likelihood of dramatic events like plane crashes, shark attacks, or terrorist incidents because these receive extensive media coverage and create powerful emotional memories. Conversely, we underestimate more common but less sensational risks like heart disease, car accidents caused by distracted driving, or household injuries. The heuristic operates because our brains evolved to make quick survival decisions based on immediately accessible information. But in modern information environments, this can lead to skewed risk assessments and poor decision-making. Media coverage amplifies the effect by repeatedly showing dramatic but statistically rare events while ignoring more mundane but frequent occurrences. Personal experience also heavily weights our availability judgments, so someone who has been in a minor earthquake may overestimate earthquake risks, while someone who has never experienced one may underestimate them. Understanding the availability heuristic helps us recognize when our intuitive probability judgments might be distorted by memory accessibility rather than actual frequency. It encourages us to seek out statistical information and base important decisions on data rather than vivid but potentially misleading examples that easily come to mind. When we perceive someone as having one strongly positive characteristic, our minds automatically assume they possess other positive traits as well, creating a cognitive bias called the halo effect. This mental shortcut means that people we find physically attractive seem more intelligent, kind, and competent than they might actually be, while those we perceive as successful in one area are assumed to be successful in others. The effect extends beyond individuals to organizations, products, and ideas, influencing everything from hiring decisions and performance evaluations to brand preferences and political opinions. A company known for innovation might be assumed to have excellent customer service, while a teacher who dresses professionally might be perceived as more knowledgeable than equally qualified colleagues who dress casually. The halo effect operates because our brains seek consistency and coherence in our perceptions, preferring simple, unified impressions over complex, nuanced evaluations. This creates efficiency in social judgments but can lead to significant errors when positive impressions in one area mask problems in others. The reverse also occurs through the horn effect, where one negative trait causes us to assume other negative characteristics exist. Understanding the halo effect helps us recognize when single positive impressions might be overly influencing our overall judgments of people or situations. It encourages us to evaluate different qualities independently, rather than letting one strong characteristic color our perception of everything else. Being aware of this bias helps us make more accurate assessments and avoid disappointment when people or things don't live up to the comprehensive excellence we imagined. Humans consistently make different explanations for their own behavior compared to others' behavior, a cognitive bias that reveals deep patterns in how we understand motivation and responsibility. When others act badly, we tend to attribute their behavior to personal character flaws, poor judgment, or moral failings. When we act badly, we tend to attribute our behavior to external circumstances, situational pressures, or factors beyond our control. This fundamental attribution error creates a systematic double standard that affects our relationships, judgments, and understanding of human behavior. If someone cuts us off in traffic, we assume they're rude and inconsiderate. If we cut someone off, we focus on how late we're running or how confusing the road signs were. When a colleague misses a deadline, we think they're disorganized or lazy. When we miss a deadline, we think about the unexpected complications and competing priorities that interfered. This bias occurs because we have complete access to our own thoughts, emotions, and circumstances, but can only observe others' external behavior without knowing their internal experience. We're acutely aware of the pressures and constraints affecting our own choices, but can only guess at the factors influencing others. The error contributes to conflicts, misunderstandings, and harsh judgments that damage relationships and communities. Understanding this bias helps us extend more compassion to others by considering the circumstances they might be facing, while also taking more responsibility for our own actions rather than always blaming external factors. When something becomes scarce or difficult to obtain, our desire for it automatically increases, even if our actual need or objective value assessment hasn't changed. This scarcity principle operates as a powerful psychological trigger that influences everything from consumer behavior and romantic attraction to resource competition and social status. Limited time offers create urgency that drives purchasing decisions, while exclusive invitations make events seem more prestigious and desirable. The principle works because scarcity often does correlate with value in natural environments where truly useful resources are limited, but it can also be artificially manipulated to influence our choices. Dating research shows that people become more attractive when they seem less available, while psychological reactance theory explains why forbidden or restricted items gain appeal simply through being off-limits. The scarcity effect intensifies when we fear losing something we already have or might have had, making loss of opportunity feel particularly painful. Marketers exploit this by creating artificial scarcity through limited editions, countdown timers, and exclusive access programs that trigger our fear of missing out. Political movements gain momentum when freedoms or opportunities seem threatened, and social groups become more cohesive when they perceive external pressure or competition for resources. Understanding the scarcity principle helps us recognize when limited availability might be influencing our desires beyond rational evaluation. It encourages us to step back and assess whether we genuinely value something or are simply responding to its perceived rarity. In emergencies or situations requiring intervention, the presence of other people paradoxically decreases the likelihood that any individual will take action to help. This counterintuitive bystander effect occurs because responsibility becomes diffused among observers, with each person assuming someone else will step forward to assist. The more bystanders present, the weaker each individual feels their personal obligation to act, leading to situations where obvious emergencies receive no help because everyone is waiting for someone else to respond. The effect operates through several psychological mechanisms. Diffusion of responsibility reduces personal accountability. Pluralistic ignorance leads people to interpret others' inaction as evidence that help isn't needed. And evaluation apprehension creates fear of looking foolish or incompetent by responding inappropriately. Research demonstrates that people are much more likely to help when they're alone with someone in need than when others are present, and that the response time to emergencies increases dramatically with the number of witnesses. The bystander effect explains tragic cases where people fail to call police during attacks, ignore medical emergencies, or stand by while bullying occurs. However, understanding the phenomenon can help overcome it by recognizing our tendency toward inaction and making conscious decisions to take responsibility, regardless of who else is present. The most effective way to combat the bystander effect is to assign specific responsibility to specific individuals rather than appealing to groups, and to model helping behavior that others can follow. When evaluating past experiences, our minds don't average all moments equally, but instead focus heavily on the most intense moment and the final moment, using these peak and ending experiences to judge the overall quality of the entire event. This peak-end rule means that a vacation with one amazing day and a pleasant final evening will be remembered more fondly than a consistently good vacation that ended with travel delays, regardless of the total positive time experienced. The bias affects how we remember everything from medical procedures and work projects to relationships and entertainment experiences. A movie with a powerful climax and satisfying conclusion will be rated higher than one with consistently good scenes, but a weak ending. A difficult conversation that ends on a positive note will be remembered more favorably than one that starts well, but concludes with conflict. The peak-end rule operates because our brains use these vivid, emotionally significant moments as shortcuts for evaluating complex experiences that contain too much information to process comprehensively. Duration has surprisingly little impact on our evaluations compared to intensity and endings, which explains why we might prefer shorter, more intense experiences over longer, milder ones. Understanding this principle helps us design better experiences by ensuring strong peak moments and positive endings, whether we're planning events, managing customer service, or structuring important conversations. It also reminds us that how we conclude interactions and experiences significantly impacts how others will remember and evaluate their entire encounter with us. Humans possess a deep-rooted tendency to comply with requests and accept information from people perceived as authorities, even when we have no independent way to verify their expertise or legitimacy. This automatic deference to authority figures emerges from evolutionary advantages of following knowledgeable leaders and social structures that maintained group cohesion and survival. The principle operates so powerfully that people will often obey instructions that conflict with their personal values or better judgment when those instructions come from someone in a position of authority. Classic psychology experiments have demonstrated that ordinary people will perform actions they find morally objectionable simply because an authority figure in a lab coat tells them to do so. In everyday life, we see this when patients follow medical advice without question, when employees comply with unreasonable requests from supervisors, or when people believe information simply because it comes from someone with impressive credentials or titles. The authority principle works through several symbols and signals: official titles, uniforms, expensive clothing, confident speech patterns, and physical markers of status all trigger automatic compliance responses. While this deference can be beneficial when authorities are genuinely knowledgeable and well-intentioned, it can also be exploited by those who understand how to project authority without possessing actual expertise. Understanding this principle helps us maintain appropriate respect for legitimate expertise while developing the critical thinking skills to evaluate authority claims independently and resist manipulation by those who would abuse our natural tendency to follow leaders. Human decision-making is strongly influenced by how much we like the person making requests or providing information, with our positive feelings toward individuals often overriding rational evaluation of their ideas or proposals. This liking principle operates through several pathways. Physical attractiveness creates an immediate positive bias, similarity in backgrounds or opinions builds rapport, compliments and flattery generate warm feelings, and shared experiences create bonds that influence future interactions. We're more likely to buy products from salespeople we find charming, vote for politicians we find personable, and accept advice from friends we enjoy spending time with, often regardless of the objective merit of what they're offering. The principle works because positive emotions associated with likable people become unconsciously transferred to their ideas, requests, and recommendations through a process called emotional conditioning. This means that our feelings about the messenger significantly impact how we receive the message, creating opportunities for both positive influence and manipulation. Skilled communicators understand that building genuine connections and finding common ground often matters more than logical arguments for persuading others. The liking principle also explains why personal attacks in political campaigns can be so effective, as negative feelings toward candidates transfer to skepticism about their policies and proposals. Understanding this bias helps us separate our evaluation of ideas from our feelings about the people presenting them, ensuring that important decisions are based on merit rather than personality preferences. It also reminds us that building positive relationships enhances our ability to influence others constructively. Once people have invested significant time, money, or effort into a project or relationship, they often continue investing even when evidence clearly shows the venture is failing and additional investment is unlikely to succeed. This sunk cost fallacy occurs because admitting failure feels like acknowledging that previous investments were wasted, creating psychological pain that motivates continued commitment to losing propositions. The fallacy manifests in countless situations: staying in unfulfilling relationships because of years invested together, continuing expensive home renovations despite escalating costs, maintaining failing business strategies because of resources already committed, or sitting through terrible movies because we paid for tickets. Rational decision-making requires evaluating future costs and benefits while ignoring past investments that cannot be recovered, but our emotional attachment to previous commitments makes this objective analysis extremely difficult. The bias intensifies when investments are public or when personal identity becomes tied to the success of the venture, making abandonment feel like admitting incompetence or poor judgment. Organizations fall victim to sunk cost thinking when they continue funding failing projects to justify previous expenditures, and individuals persist in unfulfilling career paths because changing direction would mean acknowledging years of misguided effort. Understanding the sunk cost fallacy helps us recognize when emotional attachment to past investments might be preventing rational decisions about future actions. The key insight is that money, time, and effort already spent are gone regardless of future choices, and continuing failed ventures only compounds losses rather than recovering them. Contrary to the old saying that familiarity breeds contempt, psychological research consistently demonstrates that repeated exposure to people, ideas, or objects generally increases our positive feelings toward them. This mere exposure effect operates below conscious awareness, making us prefer familiar songs, faces, brands, and concepts without realizing that familiarity is driving our preferences. The principle works because our brains are wired to perceive familiar stimuli as safer and more trustworthy than novel ones, an evolutionary adaptation that helped our ancestors distinguish between known safe environments and potentially dangerous unknown territories. Marketing professionals leverage this effect through repeated advertising that makes products feel familiar and preferable, while politicians gain advantage through name recognition that creates positive associations independent of policy positions. The effect explains why people often develop affection for initially neutral or even mildly negative stimuli after sufficient exposure, such as acquired tastes for bitter foods or appreciation for challenging art forms. In social situations, mere exposure helps explain why proximity leads to friendship, why arranged marriages often develop into loving relationships, and why prejudice against unfamiliar groups decreases with increased contact. However, the effect has limits and can reverse when exposure becomes excessive, leading to satiation and decreased preference. Understanding mere exposure helps us recognize when familiarity might be influencing our judgments and reminds us that initial negative reactions to new experiences might soften with time and repeated exposure, encouraging patience with challenging but potentially rewarding activities. When people work together in groups, individual effort and performance typically decrease compared to when they work alone, a phenomenon called social loafing that occurs across cultures and contexts. This reduction in individual contribution happens because personal accountability becomes diffused in group settings, making it easier for individuals to coast on others' efforts without being detected or held responsible. The effect intensifies as group size increases, with each additional member reducing the average individual contribution to collective tasks. Social loafing emerges from several psychological factors. Reduced identifiability makes individual performance harder to track. Diffusion of responsibility means each person feels less personally accountable for group outcomes, and social comparison processes lead people to match the effort level they perceive others are contributing. The phenomenon explains why brainstorming sessions often produce fewer creative ideas per person than individual ideation, why group projects frequently suffer from unequal participation, and why large committees can be less efficient than smaller ones. However, social loafing can be reduced through several strategies, making individual contributions identifiable and measurable, increasing personal investment in group outcomes, creating meaningful roles that utilize individual strengths, and establishing clear accountability systems. Understanding social loafing helps us structure group work more effectively by maintaining individual responsibility while capturing the benefits of collaboration. It also reminds us to be conscious of our own tendency to reduce effort in group settings and to actively contribute our fair share to collective endeavors. Humans systematically underestimate the time, costs, and risks involved in completing future tasks while overestimating their benefits, a cognitive bias called the planning fallacy that affects everything from simple daily activities to major construction projects. This optimistic bias occurs because we focus on best-case scenarios while failing to account for the delays, complications, and unexpected obstacles that commonly arise during implementation. When estimating how long it will take to finish a report, clean the house, or complete a renovation project, we typically imagine everything going smoothly without interruptions, technical difficulties, or competing priorities that might interfere with our progress. The fallacy persists even when we have extensive experience with similar tasks that took longer than expected, suggesting that the bias operates at a fundamental level of human cognition rather than simply reflecting inexperience or poor memory. Research shows that people can accurately estimate completion times for others' projects while remaining overly optimistic about their own, indicating that the bias specifically affects self-referential thinking. The planning fallacy contributes to chronic lateness, budget overruns, missed deadlines, and the stress that comes from consistently falling behind schedule. Understanding this bias helps us build more realistic timelines by adding buffer time for unexpected delays, considering past experiences with similar tasks, and seeking outside perspectives that aren't influenced by our optimistic assumptions. The key insight is that our natural optimism, while often beneficial for motivation and well-being, can systematically distort our planning and time management. The moment we take ownership of something, our psychological attachment to that object increases dramatically, making us value it more highly than we did before we owned it, and more highly than others value identical items. This endowment effect explains why people demand much more money to sell items they own than they would be willing to pay to buy the same items, creating apparent irrationalities in economic behavior. The bias operates because ownership triggers loss aversion, making the prospect of giving up owned items feel psychologically painful in ways that not acquiring items does not. Research demonstrates the effect using simple experiments where people given coffee mugs randomly value them much more highly than people given chocolate bars who are offered the opportunity to trade, even though preferences between mugs and chocolate were evenly distributed before ownership was established. The endowment effect influences major life decisions, such as staying in homes that no longer meet our needs because selling feels like losing something valuable, keeping investments longer than rational analysis would suggest, and maintaining subscriptions or memberships we rarely use simply because canceling feels like giving up benefits we possess. Understanding the endowment effect helps us recognize when ownership bias might be influencing our decisions and encourages more objective evaluation of whether keeping or changing our current situations truly serves our interests. It also explains why trial periods and money-back guarantees are effective sales strategies, as they allow potential customers to experience ownership and trigger the bias toward keeping products. When groups become highly cohesive and insulated from outside perspectives, they often develop a tendency to suppress dissent and critical thinking in favor of maintaining harmony and consensus, a phenomenon called groupthink that can lead to poor decision-making and disastrous outcomes. This psychological dynamic occurs when group members prioritize agreement and solidarity over accurate analysis and honest debate, creating an illusion of unanimity that masks underlying doubts and alternative viewpoints. Groupthink typically emerges in groups with strong leadership, high cohesion, insulation from outside opinions, and pressure to make important decisions quickly. Under these conditions, members begin to self-censor doubts, dismiss external criticism, and pressure dissenters to conform, creating a false sense of certainty and invulnerability. The phenomenon has contributed to historical disasters including military defeats, business failures, and policy mistakes where warning signs were ignored and alternative strategies were never seriously considered. Groupthink manifests through several warning signs: illusions of unanimity, where silence is interpreted as agreement, mind guards who protect the group from troubling information, stereotyping of outsiders as weak or evil, and unquestioned belief in the group's inherent morality. Understanding groupthink helps us recognize when team harmony might be suppressing necessary critical evaluation and encourages the cultivation of constructive dissent through devil's advocate roles, outside consultation, and explicit invitation of alternative viewpoints. The goal isn't to eliminate group cohesion, which provides many benefits, but to maintain space for honest disagreement and thorough analysis. Human perception operates through constant comparison, with our evaluation of any stimulus heavily influenced by what we encounter immediately before or alongside it, rather than being based on absolute standards. This contrast principle means that the same temperature feels cold after coming from a hot room, but warm after coming from a cold room. The same price seems expensive compared to budget options, but reasonable compared to luxury alternatives. Our brains process information relationally, rather than absolutely, using surrounding context to determine whether something should be categorized as large or small, fast or slow, good or bad. This perceptual mechanism evolved to help us detect changes and differences that might signal opportunities or threats, but it can also be systematically exploited to influence our judgments and decisions. Retailers use contrast by placing expensive items next to moderately priced ones to make the moderate prices seem reasonable, while restaurants list one extremely expensive dish to make other high-priced items appear more affordable by comparison. In social situations, our satisfaction with our own circumstances depends largely on who we compare ourselves to, explaining why people can feel poor in wealthy neighborhoods but rich in struggling communities regardless of their absolute financial situation. Understanding the contrast principle helps us recognize when our perceptions might be distorted by contextual comparisons and encourages us to seek broader perspectives before making important evaluations. It also reminds us that our emotional reactions to experiences often depend more on our expectations and comparison points than on the objective qualities of the experiences themselves. Deep within human psychology lies a powerful drive to feel that we have some degree of control over our environment and circumstances, with perceived control serving as a crucial factor in mental health, motivation, and resilience. When people feel that they can influence outcomes through their actions, they experience lower stress, better physical health, increased motivation, and greater life satisfaction. Conversely, feelings of helplessness and lack of control contribute to depression, anxiety, and a host of physical ailments that emerge from chronic stress responses. This need for control is so fundamental that people will often prefer to make choices even when all available options are equally poor, and they will sometimes create illusions of control in situations that are actually determined by chance. The principle explains why autonomy at work increases job satisfaction more than higher pay, why patients recover better when they feel involved in treatment decisions, and why elderly people in nursing homes live longer when given choices about daily activities. However, the need for control can become problematic when taken to extremes, leading to micromanagement, resistance to necessary changes, or anxiety when facing genuinely uncontrollable situations. Understanding this psychological need helps us design environments and relationships that provide appropriate levels of choice and influence while also developing acceptance of the many aspects of life that remain beyond our direct control. The key insight is that perceived control often matters more than actual control, suggesting that giving people meaningful choices and voice in decisions significantly impacts their well-being and performance. While having choices generally improves well-being, research reveals that too many options can actually decrease satisfaction and increase anxiety, creating a psychological paradox where abundance leads to paralysis rather than happiness. When faced with an overwhelming array of choices, people often delay decisions, make poorer selections, or experience regret about options not chosen, even when they objectively receive better outcomes than they would with fewer alternatives. This choice overload occurs because our cognitive resources become strained when evaluating numerous options, leading to decision fatigue that impairs judgment and reduces satisfaction with final choices. Studies demonstrate that consumers are less likely to make purchases when confronted with extensive product lines, students become paralyzed when choosing from too many course options, and people report lower satisfaction with decisions made from large choice sets compared to smaller ones. The paradox intensifies in cultures that highly value individual choice and personal responsibility, where the burden of choosing correctly feels heavier and the regret from suboptimal choices feels more personal. Additionally, having many options raises expectations about finding the perfect choice, making any actual selection feel disappointing by comparison to imagined alternatives. Understanding the paradox of choice helps us recognize when abundance might be hindering rather than helping decision-making, and suggests strategies like setting personal criteria before evaluating options, limiting the number of alternatives we consider, and accepting satisficing rather than optimizing when stakes are relatively low. The key insight is that freedom and happiness don't always increase together. Throughout daily interactions, people continuously monitor and adjust their emotional expressions to match social expectations and maintain relationships, performing what sociologists call emotional labor that requires significant mental and physical energy. This invisible work involves suppressing authentic feelings that might be inappropriate for the situation while displaying emotions that others expect or need to see, regardless of our internal emotional state. Service workers smile at difficult customers, healthcare providers remain calm during crises, parents model patience when feeling frustrated, and friends offer enthusiasm for others' good news even when dealing with personal struggles. The rules of emotional labor vary by gender, profession, social role, and cultural context, with some groups expected to provide more emotional support and regulation than others. Women often face higher expectations for emotional caretaking and expression management, while certain professions require extensive emotion work as a core job requirement. This constant emotional performance can lead to burnout, authenticity struggles, and emotional exhaustion when the gap between felt and displayed emotions becomes too large or sustained. However, emotional labor also serves important social functions by maintaining harmony, supporting others' well-being, and facilitating smooth interpersonal interactions. Understanding emotional labor helps us recognize the effort involved in emotion management and develop appreciation for others' emotional contributions to relationships and communities. It also encourages us to find healthy balances between authentic expression and appropriate social responsiveness, ensuring that emotional labor enhances rather than depletes our relationships. People consistently overestimate how much attention others pay to their appearance, behavior, and mistakes, imagining that they're under a social spotlight that highlights their every action when most observers are actually focused on their own concerns. This spotlight effect occurs because we have privileged access to our own thoughts, feelings, and self-consciousness, making our internal experience feel much more visible and important than it actually appears to others. When we spill something on our shirt, stumble while walking, or say something awkward, we assume everyone notices and remembers these moments, but research shows that observers typically pay much less attention and forget incidents much more quickly than we imagine. The effect contributes to social anxiety, self-consciousness, and avoidance of situations where we might look foolish or imperfect, even though most people are too preoccupied with their own lives to scrutinize our behavior carefully. The illusion of transparency, a related phenomenon, makes us feel that our internal emotions and thoughts are obvious to others when they're actually quite difficult for outsiders to detect accurately. Understanding the spotlight effect helps reduce social anxiety by reminding us that others are generally much less focused on our performance than we assume they are. It encourages taking social risks like speaking up in meetings, trying new activities, or expressing authentic opinions without excessive worry about judgment. The liberating insight is that most people are starring in their own psychological dramas and have limited attention available for critiquing our supporting roles in their stories. Individuals with low ability in particular domains often dramatically overestimate their competence, while those with high ability tend to underestimate their skills relative to others, creating a cognitive bias where incompetence breeds confidence and expertise breeds humility. This Dunning-Kruger effect occurs because the same skills needed to perform well in an area are also required to recognize good performance and evaluate one's own abilities accurately. People who lack competence in driving, logical reasoning, grammar, or humor not only perform poorly, but also lack the metacognitive skills to realize their deficiencies, leading them to feel more confident than objectively warranted. Meanwhile, highly skilled individuals assume that tasks easy for them are equally easy for others, causing them to underestimate their relative abilities and accomplishments. The effect explains why incompetent politicians feel qualified to make policy decisions, why poor drivers consider themselves above average, and why people with minimal knowledge feel comfortable making confident pronouncements about complex topics. It also illuminates why genuine experts often express uncertainty and acknowledge limitations, while novices make bold claims with complete assurance. The Dunning-Kruger effect has implications for education, hiring, self-improvement, and public discourse, suggesting that confidence levels are poor indicators of actual competence. Understanding this bias helps us maintain appropriate humility about our own abilities while seeking feedback and continued learning. It also encourages us to be skeptical of overconfident claims from others and to value expertise even when experts express uncertainty about complex issues. Human beings possess a remarkable psychological tendency to adapt to improved circumstances and return to relatively stable levels of happiness and life satisfaction, a process called hedonic adaptation that explains why lottery winners aren't significantly happier than others after initial adjustment periods. This adaptation mechanism evolved to help us survive by preventing complacency during good times and avoiding despair during difficult periods. But it also means that material improvements and external achievements provide smaller and more temporary happiness boosts than we typically expect. People adapt to salary increases, luxury purchases, better housing, and even improved health relatively quickly, with the initial satisfaction fading as new circumstances become the normal baseline for comparison. The same adaptation occurs with negative events, helping explain how people can maintain reasonable well-being despite serious setbacks, chronic illnesses, or major losses that initially seem devastating. However, adaptation isn't complete or universal, with some experiences providing lasting happiness benefits and others creating enduring impacts on well-being. Research suggests that experiences adapt less completely than material purchases. Relationships and social connections resist adaptation better than individual achievements, and varied experiences maintain their impact longer than repetitive ones. Understanding hedonic adaptation helps set realistic expectations about what will and won't create lasting happiness, encouraging focus on activities and relationships that resist adaptation while reducing disappointment when positive changes don't provide permanent satisfaction boosts. The insight suggests that pursuing happiness through external changes has limited effectiveness compared to developing internal resources and meaningful connections. Contrary to intuitive expectations, when we do favors for other people, we tend to like them more rather than feeling imposed upon or resentful, a counterintuitive psychological phenomenon named after Benjamin Franklin, who reportedly used this principle to win over a political rival. The effect occurs because our brains seek consistency between our actions and attitudes, so when we help someone, we unconsciously rationalize this behavior by deciding that we must like the person since we chose to assist them. This cognitive dissonance resolution makes us view people more favorably after we've invested effort in helping them, creating a psychological bond that strengthens over time with repeated assistance. The Benjamin Franklin effect explains why hazing and initiation rituals often increase group loyalty rather than resentment, why people become more committed to organizations after volunteering time and effort, and why asking for small favors can be an effective relationship-building strategy. The principle works because humans have a fundamental need to maintain consistent self-concepts, so when our actions suggest we care about someone, our attitudes adjust to match this implied caring. However, the effect has limits and can reverse when favors become excessive, one-sided, or feel manipulative rather than freely chosen. Understanding this effect helps us recognize how helping others naturally builds affection and connection, encouraging generous behavior that benefits both recipients and givers. It also suggests that allowing others to help us can strengthen their positive feelings toward us, making occasional requests for assistance a relationship-building tool rather than a burden on others. When people perceive that their freedom of choice is being threatened or eliminated, they experience psychological reactance that motivates them to restore their autonomy by pursuing the restricted option more vigorously than they would have otherwise. This reactance response occurs because humans have a fundamental need for control and self-determination, making any limitation on freedom feel psychologically threatening regardless of whether the restricted option was initially desired. The phenomenon explains why telling children not to touch something makes them want to touch it more, why censorship often increases interest in banned materials, and why hard-to-get romantic partners become more attractive than easily available ones. Reactance manifests in everything from consumer behavior, where limited-time offers create urgency, to political movements, where government restrictions can increase support for forbidden activities or ideas. The effect intensifies when people feel that restrictions are unfair, arbitrary, or imposed by illegitimate authorities, and when the threatened freedom is important to personal identity or values. Marketing professionals exploit reactance by creating artificial scarcity or exclusive access that triggers desire for restricted products, while parents and educators can minimize reactance by offering choices within acceptable boundaries rather than imposing absolute restrictions. Understanding reactance helps us recognize when our attraction to something might be influenced more by its forbidden nature than by its intrinsic value, and suggests communication strategies that preserve others' sense of autonomy while still providing guidance or boundaries. The key insight is that the way restrictions are framed and implemented significantly affects whether they create compliance or rebellion. People develop stronger emotional attachments and assign higher value to products, ideas, or outcomes that they've had a hand in creating, even when their contributions are minimal, or the final results are objectively inferior to professionally made alternatives. This IKEA effect, named after the furniture company whose customers assemble their own purchases, occurs because the effort invested in creation becomes psychologically associated with the object's worth, making our own work feel more valuable than equivalent work done by others. The phenomenon extends far beyond furniture assembly to explain why people overvalue their own ideas in brainstorming sessions, why home-cooked meals taste better to the cook than to diners, why children's artwork feels precious to parents, and why do-it-yourself projects create satisfaction disproportionate to their objective quality. The effect operates through several psychological mechanisms. Effort justification makes us rationalize our work as worthwhile, ownership feelings develop through the creative process, and competent satisfaction emerges from successfully completing challenging tasks. However, the IKEA effect has limits and can disappear when tasks become too difficult or frustrating, when people lack the skills needed for successful completion, or when the effort required seems excessive relative to potential benefits. Understanding this bias helps explain why collaborative processes that involve stakeholders in solution development often generate more buy-in than top-down implementations, why customization options increase customer satisfaction, and why learning experiences that require active participation create stronger retention than passive consumption. The insight suggests that involving people in creating solutions to their own problems often generates more commitment than providing ready-made answers. When highly competent or attractive people make minor mistakes or reveal small flaws, they often become more likable and relatable rather than less appealing, a social phenomenon called the pratfall effect that demonstrates how perceived perfection can actually distance us from others. This counterintuitive pattern occurs because minor imperfections make accomplished individuals seem more human and approachable, reducing the psychological distance that extreme competence can create and allowing others to identify with them more easily. The effect works only for people who are already perceived as highly capable or attractive, as mistakes by those seen as incompetent simply reinforce negative impressions rather than creating endearing vulnerability. Research shows that when expert speakers stumble slightly during presentations, audiences rate them as more likable than when they deliver flawless performances, and that attractive people who spill coffee on themselves become more appealing to observers. The pratfall effect explains why successful politicians benefit from admitting minor personal struggles, why celebrities gain popularity when they acknowledge mistakes or insecurities, and why social media posts showing glamorous people in unglamorous moments often receive positive responses. However, the effect depends on the mistake being minor and unrelated to core competencies, as serious errors or character flaws can still damage reputations regardless of overall competence. Understanding the pratfall effect suggests that modest self-disclosure of weaknesses or mistakes can actually enhance relationships and leadership effectiveness by making us appear more authentic, and relatable. It encourages embracing our imperfections rather than hiding them, recognizing that vulnerability often strengthens rather than weakens social connections. Interrupted or incomplete tasks create persistent mental tension that keeps them active in our consciousness long after finished tasks fade from awareness, a psychological phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect that explains why we remember unfinished business so much more vividly than accomplished work. This cognitive bias occurs because our brains maintain heightened attention for uncompleted goals and obligations, creating intrusive thoughts that continue until tasks reach resolution or are consciously abandoned. The effect manifests when we can't stop thinking about unfinished projects at work, when incomplete conversations continue running through our minds, or when unresolved conflicts with others create persistent mental background noise that interferes with focus and relaxation. Television producers exploit the Zeigarnik effect by ending episodes with cliffhangers that keep viewers thinking about shows between episodes, while procrastination often intensifies because delayed tasks occupy increasing mental space as deadlines approach. The psychological tension from unfinished business can be both motivating and exhausting, providing energy to complete important tasks, while also creating stress and mental clutter that reduces overall cognitive performance. However, the effect can be managed through strategies like writing down incomplete tasks to externalize the mental tracking, breaking large projects into smaller completable steps, and consciously deciding to abandon or postpone certain unfinished items. Understanding the Zeigarnik effect helps explain why closure is so psychologically important and why leaving tasks incomplete can drain mental energy even when we're not actively working on them. It suggests that effective productivity and stress management require attention to completing or properly organizing unfinished business rather than simply starting new activities. Named after Garrison Keillor's fictional town where all children are above average, the Lake Wobegon effect describes the widespread tendency for people to overestimate their own abilities and positive qualities relative to others. This self-serving bias appears across virtually every domain where comparison is possible, with the majority of people rating themselves as better than average drivers, more ethical than typical individuals, above average in intelligence, and more attractive than most others. The effect persists even in areas where mathematical logic makes it impossible for most people to actually be above average, creating a collective delusion that reveals deep patterns in human self-perception. This optimistic bias serves important psychological functions by maintaining self-esteem, motivation, and mental health, as people who view themselves more realistically often show higher rates of depression and anxiety. However, the Lake Wobegon effect can also lead to overconfidence, poor decision-making, and interpersonal conflicts when inflated self-assessments clash with external feedback or others' perceptions. The bias appears stronger for positive traits than negative ones, with people more willing to acknowledge average or below average performance in areas they consider less important to their identity. Cultural factors influence the strength of the effect, with individualistic societies showing stronger self-enhancement biases than collectivistic ones. Understanding this effect helps us maintain healthy skepticism about our own self-assessments, while appreciating that some degree of positive illusion may be necessary for psychological well-being and motivation to pursue challenging goals. In many group situations, individuals privately hold different views or feelings than they believe others in the group possess, creating pluralistic ignorance where everyone assumes they're the only one who feels differently from the apparent group consensus. This psychological phenomenon occurs because people base their judgments about others' internal states on observable behavior, which may not accurately reflect private thoughts and emotions that individuals choose not to express publicly. Classic examples include college students who privately drink less than they believe their peers do, but conform to perceived drinking norms, audience members who don't find a performance entertaining but assume others are enjoying it based on polite applause, or employees who privately disagree with company policies but assume colleagues support them based on public compliance. Pluralistic ignorance perpetuates behaviors and norms that few people actually endorse privately, creating false social realities that can persist for long periods because no one wants to be the first to voice dissent. The phenomenon contributes to the bystander effect in emergencies, where people interpret others' inaction as evidence that help isn't needed, rather than recognizing that everyone might be experiencing the same uncertainty. Understanding pluralistic ignorance helps explain how unpopular practices can maintain social support and why individuals often feel isolated when their private views may actually be widely shared. It encourages more open communication about genuine feelings and opinions, suggesting that voicing authentic perspectives can help reveal hidden consensus and create positive social change. When making decisions and judgments, people often rely on their immediate emotional responses to guide their choices, rather than conducting systematic logical analysis, using what psychologists call the affect heuristic to navigate complex decisions quickly and efficiently. This emotional decision-making system operates automatically and unconsciously, with positive feelings toward an option leading us to perceive more benefits and fewer risks, while negative feelings bias us toward seeing more risks and fewer benefits. The heuristic explains why we make different financial decisions when we're in good moods versus bad moods, why products associated with positive emotions seem more valuable regardless of objective features, and why political candidates who evoke warm feelings receive more favorable policy evaluations than those who don't create emotional connections. Research demonstrates that people with brain damage to emotional processing centers struggle to make effective decisions despite intact logical reasoning abilities, suggesting that emotions provide crucial information for navigation through complex choice environments. The affect heuristic can lead to both good and poor decisions, helping us quickly identify beneficial opportunities and threats while also creating biases that prevent accurate risk assessment. Understanding this principle helps explain why purely rational arguments often fail to persuade when they conflict with emotional responses, and why effective communication must address feelings as well as facts. It also suggests that paying attention to our emotional reactions can provide valuable decision-making information while recognizing when those reactions might be leading us astray from our longer-term interests and values. Once people acquire knowledge or expertise in a particular area, they find it extremely difficult to imagine what it was like not to know that information, creating a cognitive bias called the curse of knowledge that impairs their ability to communicate effectively with novices. This curse manifests when teachers assume students understand concepts that seem obvious to experts, when technical specialists use jargon that confuses outsiders, or when experienced professionals forget how overwhelming their field can appear to newcomers. The bias occurs because knowledge becomes so integrated into our thinking that we cannot consciously access our pre-knowledge mental states, making it nearly impossible to anticipate what will be confusing or unclear to others. The curse of knowledge contributes to poor instruction, ineffective communication, and frustration between experts and novices across domains from academic teaching and technical support to parenting and relationship advice. It also affects product design when creators assume users will intuitively understand features that require specialized knowledge, and strategic planning when experienced teams cannot envision obstacles that seem obvious to outsiders. However, awareness of the curse can improve communication through deliberate efforts to identify and explain assumptions, seek feedback from representative novices, and systematically consider what background knowledge might be missing. Understanding this bias helps experts develop empathy for learners' perspectives and reminds us that our own expertise can become a barrier to helping others unless we consciously work to bridge the knowledge gap. The key insight is that teaching and communication effectiveness requires unlearning our expertise temporarily to meet people where they are. People possess a psychological motivation to defend and justify the social, economic, and political systems in which they live, even when those systems work against their personal interests or create unfair outcomes for their social groups. This system justification tendency emerges from fundamental needs to reduce uncertainty and maintain a sense that the world is predictable and fair, making it psychologically easier to rationalize existing arrangements than to acknowledge that current systems might be unjust or arbitrary. The phenomenon helps explain why individuals often blame themselves for systemic problems, why disadvantaged groups sometimes oppose policies that would benefit them, and why people resist social changes that could improve their circumstances. System justification manifests when workers defend corporate practices that exploit them, when citizens support political policies that harm their economic interests, or when members of marginalized groups internalize stereotypes about their own abilities or worth. The tendency intensifies during times of threat or uncertainty, when people cling more strongly to familiar structures that provide psychological security. However, system justification can also contribute to social stability and cooperation by reducing conflict and promoting acceptance of necessary rules and institutions. Understanding this bias helps explain resistance to social change and reform efforts, suggesting that effective advocacy must address the psychological needs that system justification serves rather than simply pointing out logical inconsistencies. It also reminds us to examine our own assumptions about whether current arrangements are truly optimal or simply familiar and comfortable. When people actively generate information rather than passively reading or hearing it, they remember that information significantly better, a memory phenomenon called the generation effect that has important implications for learning, problem-solving, and personal development. This enhanced memory occurs because the mental effort required to produce answers, complete partial information, or solve problems creates deeper processing and stronger neural pathways than simple exposure to complete information. Students who work through math problems remember solutions better than those who simply read worked examples. People who brainstorm their own solutions to challenges implement them more successfully than those given ready-made answers, and individuals who articulate their own reasons for decisions show stronger commitment than those provided with external justifications. The generation effect operates through several mechanisms. The effort involved in production creates more elaborate memory traces, self-generated information connects more readily to existing knowledge networks, and the act of creation itself provides additional retrieval cues that aid later recall. The effect extends beyond individual learning to group dynamics, where ideas generated through collaborative brainstorming often receive more support than suggestions imposed by authorities. However, the generation effect requires that people possess enough background knowledge to produce meaningful responses, as generating incorrect information can actually impair learning. Understanding this principle suggests that effective education and training should emphasize active production rather than passive consumption, encouraging learners to work through problems, generate examples, and create their own explanations rather than simply absorbing pre-packaged information. When people think about how much a particular circumstance contributes to their happiness or life satisfaction, they tend to dramatically overestimate its impact because the act of focusing attention on any single factor makes it seem more important than it actually is in the context of overall well-being. This focusing illusion explains why people believe that getting married, earning more money, moving to a better climate, or achieving career success will make them much happier than these changes typically do, while also overestimating how much negative events like health problems or relationship difficulties will diminish their quality of life. The bias occurs because when we direct our attention to specific life domains, those areas temporarily dominate our consciousness and seem to represent a larger portion of life satisfaction than they actually contribute when we're not actively thinking about them. Research demonstrates that people consistently overestimate how much regional differences in weather affect residents' happiness, how much income increases improve well-being beyond basic needs, and how much physical attractiveness influences overall life satisfaction. The focusing illusion contributes to poor life decisions when people make major changes based on exaggerated expectations about single factors, while neglecting the many other elements that contribute to happiness and adjustment. Understanding this bias helps us maintain more realistic expectations about how much any single change will improve our lives and encourages attention to the full range of factors that contribute to well-being rather than fixating on individual elements that capture our current attention. When choosing between options, people's preferences can be systematically influenced by the presence of additional alternatives that no rational person would actually select, a phenomenon called the decoy effect that reveals how context shapes decision-making in unexpected ways. This effect occurs when a strategically designed inferior option makes one of the original choices appear more attractive by comparison, even though the decoy option is never chosen and logically shouldn't affect preferences between the original alternatives. Classic examples include movie theaters offering small popcorn for $4, medium for $6.50, and large for $7, where the overpriced medium makes the large seem like excellent value, or magazine subscriptions offering online only for $59, print only for $125, and both for $125, where the print-only option makes the combined subscription seem like a bargain. The decoy effect works because people use relative comparisons rather than absolute evaluations when making decisions, with the presence of an inferior option shifting the reference point for judging value. Marketing professionals regularly exploit this bias by designing product lines that include options specifically intended to make target products look more appealing rather than to generate direct sales. Understanding the decoy effect helps us recognize when our preferences might be influenced by irrelevant options and encourages more careful consideration of our actual needs and values rather than simply choosing what appears to be the best deal relative to available alternatives. It reminds us that the framing of choices can significantly impact our decisions, even when the fundamental options remain unchanged. People consistently underestimate how much their current emotional state influences their thinking and decision-making, while also struggling to accurately predict how they'll feel and behave when in different emotional states, creating empathy gaps that lead to poor planning and self-understanding. When we're calm and rational, we underestimate how much fear, anger, hunger, or excitement will affect our future choices, while when we're experiencing intense emotions, we assume those feelings will persist longer than they typically do. This hot-cold empathy gap manifests when people make shopping lists while full, but still buy too much food when hungry, when individuals promise to exercise regularly while motivated, but struggle to maintain routines when energy is low, or when couples make relationship decisions during passionate moments that they later regret in calmer states. The gap operates because our current emotional state serves as an anchor that biases predictions about future feelings, while we also lack vivid memories of what different emotional states actually feel like when we're not experiencing them. This leads to systematic errors in self-prediction that affect everything from financial planning and health decisions to relationship choices and career moves. Understanding the empathy gap helps us make better decisions by building in safeguards for different emotional states, such as automatic savings plans that work regardless of spending moods, or cooling off periods before making major commitments during high emotion times. It also encourages greater empathy for others who are in emotional states different from our current one, recognizing that their behavior may make perfect sense given their internal experience. People respond with greater empathy and generosity to specific, identifiable victims than to statistical information about larger numbers of people suffering from the same problems, a psychological phenomenon that helps explain disparities in charitable giving, public attention, and policy responses to different types of suffering. A single named child's photo raises more money for hunger relief than statistics about millions of malnourished children. Individual disaster victims receive more media coverage and donations than equally severe but widespread problems affecting larger populations anonymously. This identifiable victim effect occurs because concrete individuals activate our emotional systems and allow us to form mental connections that abstract numbers cannot trigger, making specific suffering feel more real and urgent than statistical suffering. The effect demonstrates a fundamental limitation in human moral psychology, where our empathy systems evolved to respond to immediate, visible suffering within small social groups rather than abstract, distant problems affecting large populations. While this bias can lead to inefficient allocation of helping resources toward dramatic individual cases rather than systematic problems affecting more people, it also reveals the power of storytelling and personal connection for motivating pro-social behavior. Understanding the identifiable victim effect helps explain why effective advocacy often focuses on individual stories rather than statistics, why media coverage of single dramatic events can overshadow ongoing crises, and why charitable organizations feature specific beneficiaries rather than just reporting aggregate need. It also reminds us to consciously consider whether our emotional responses to specific cases reflect appropriate priorities given the broader scope of problems requiring attention and resources. When confident, competent individuals reveal small vulnerabilities or admit minor mistakes, they often become more likable and trustworthy rather than losing credibility, demonstrating how authentic imperfection can strengthen rather than weaken social connections. This enhanced relatability occurs because displays of vulnerability signal that someone is genuine and honest enough to acknowledge their limitations, making them appear more human and accessible to others who also struggle with imperfections. Leaders who admit when they don't know something, experts who acknowledge the boundaries of their knowledge, and successful people who share their struggles create deeper connections than those who maintain facades of flawless competence. The effect works because vulnerability requires courage and self-awareness that people intuitively recognize and respect, while also reducing the psychological distance that exceptional competence can create between individuals. Research shows that leaders who appropriately share challenges and uncertainties often inspire more loyalty and cooperation than those who project unwavering confidence, and that authentic self-disclosure strengthens relationships more than impression management strategies. However, the vulnerability must be genuine rather than calculated, proportionate to the relationship and context, and balanced with demonstrated competence in relevant areas. Understanding this principle encourages authenticity in leadership and relationships, while recognizing that strategic perfectionism can actually undermine the trust and connection it's intended to create. The key insight is that people connect more readily with those who acknowledge their humanity rather than those who claim superiority. Most people exhibit a systematic bias toward believing that positive events are more likely to happen to them personally than to other people, while simultaneously thinking that negative events are less likely to affect them than others, creating an optimism bias that influences everything from career planning to health behaviors. This psychological tendency leads individuals to overestimate their chances of achieving success, finding happiness, avoiding illness, and experiencing positive life outcomes while underestimating their vulnerability to divorce, accidents, job loss, and other difficulties that affect many people. The optimism bias serves important psychological functions by maintaining motivation, reducing anxiety, and supporting mental health, as people who lack this positive outlook often struggle with depression and hopelessness that can become self-fulfilling prophecies. However, the bias can also lead to inadequate preparation for realistic risks, insufficient insurance coverage, poor financial planning, and neglect of preventive health measures that assume problems happen to other people, but not to ourselves. The effect intensifies for events that feel personally controllable and distant in time, with people showing stronger optimism bias about outcomes they believe they can influence and events that won't occur immediately. Cultural factors also shape the bias, with individualistic societies typically showing stronger optimism effects than collectivistic ones. Understanding optimism bias helps us harness its motivational benefits while maintaining realistic assessment of risks and preparation for challenges that may arise despite our hopeful expectations about the future. People possess a powerful psychological drive to find meaning, purpose, and significance in their experiences, relationships, and existence, often creating explanatory narratives and causal connections even when events are largely random or meaningless. This fundamental need for meaning helps humans cope with uncertainty, maintain motivation through difficulties, and create coherent identities that provide direction and value for their lives. When faced with tragedy, setbacks, or apparent randomness, people typically search for lessons, silver linings, or deeper purposes that transform potentially meaningless suffering into opportunities for growth or contribution. The meaning-making process involves constructing stories that explain why events occurred, what can be learned from experiences, and how individual lives fit into larger patterns of significance and purpose. This psychological need manifests in religious and spiritual beliefs. conspiracy theories that provide explanations for complex events, superstitious behaviors that create illusions of control, and personal philosophies that frame life experiences as meaningful rather than arbitrary. While meaning-making can sometimes lead to false beliefs or self-deception, it also provides crucial psychological resources for resilience, motivation, and well-being that help people navigate challenges and maintain hope. Research shows that individuals with strong sense of life meaning report higher satisfaction, better health, and greater persistence through difficulties than those who struggle to find purpose. Understanding this fundamental need helps us recognize how important it is to cultivate sources of meaning in our lives while remaining open to different ways that people create significance and purpose in their unique circumstances. When ideas or claims are repeated frequently across multiple sources and contexts, they gradually become more believable and accepted regardless of their actual truth value, creating availability cascades where repetition substitutes for evidence in shaping public opinion and individual beliefs. This phenomenon occurs because frequent exposure makes information feel more familiar and accessible in memory, which our brains unconsciously interpret as indicators of truth and importance. Social media amplifies availability cascades by creating echo chambers where the same ideas circulate repeatedly among connected networks, making fringe viewpoints seem mainstream and giving unsubstantiated claims the appearance of widespread acceptance. The effect helps explain how urban legends persist despite being debunked, how political narratives gain credibility through repetition across partisan media, and how marketing messages become accepted truths through sustained advertising campaigns. Availability cascades can create false consensus around ideas that lack empirical support, while also suppressing alternative viewpoints that receive less repetition and attention. The phenomenon demonstrates how the information environment shapes beliefs independent of actual evidence, with the frequency and prominence of exposure competing with accuracy as determinants of what people accept as true. Understanding availability cascades helps us evaluate information more critically by considering the source diversity and evidence base behind repeated claims, rather than accepting ideas simply because they feel familiar. It also reminds us to seek out diverse information sources and actively question assumptions that seem obviously true, recognizing that obviousness might reflect repetition rather than reality. People tend to accept vague general personality descriptions as remarkably accurate when told that the descriptions are specifically tailored for them personally, even when the same descriptions are given to everyone, a phenomenon called the Forer effect that helps explain the appeal of astrology, personality tests, and fortune-telling. This psychological bias occurs because humans are naturally inclined to search for personal meaning and connection in information, focusing on elements that seem to apply to their experience while overlooking parts that don't fit. The effect works best with statements that are generally flattering, contain some negative elements for credibility, and include common human experiences that most people can relate to in some way. Classic Forer effect statements include phrases like, "You have a great need for other people to like and admire you," or "You have considerable unused capacity that you have not turned to your advantage," which feel personally insightful because they address universal human concerns. The bias helps explain why people find value in horoscopes, personality assessments, and psychic readings that use skillfully crafted general statements rather than specific, verifiable predictions. While the Forer effect can lead to acceptance of unfounded beliefs, it also reveals the deep human need for understanding, validation, and personal insight that drives people to seek meaning in various sources of guidance. Understanding this effect helps us evaluate personality assessments and advice more critically while recognizing our natural tendency to find personal significance in general statements that are designed to feel individually relevant. Humans possess a strong psychological motivation to believe that the world is fundamentally fair and just, where good people are rewarded and bad people are punished, even when evidence clearly contradicts this worldview. This just world hypothesis helps people maintain sense of control and predictability by assuming that outcomes are related to character and behavior, rather than random chance or systemic factors beyond individual control. The belief manifests when people blame victims for their misfortunes, assume that successful individuals must have earned their advantages, or expect that moral behavior will be rewarded while immoral actions will be punished. This psychological need for cosmic justice leads to victim blaming in cases of crime, poverty, illness, and discrimination, where observers unconsciously search for ways the victims might have contributed to their own suffering rather than acknowledging the role of chance or injustice. The just world bias also creates unrealistic expectations about life outcomes, leading people to assume that working hard and being good will guarantee success, while bad outcomes only happen to those who deserve them. However, the hypothesis serves important psychological functions by maintaining motivation to behave ethically, reducing anxiety about random misfortune, and providing frameworks for understanding complex social outcomes. Understanding this bias helps us recognize when our desire for justice might be distorting our perception of events and encourages more nuanced thinking about the complex factors that influence life outcomes. It also reminds us to extend compassion to those experiencing difficulties rather than assuming they must have caused their own problems. Human attention operates like a sophisticated filtering system that can focus on specific sounds or conversations while simultaneously monitoring background information for personally relevant details, a phenomenon called the cocktail party effect that demonstrates our remarkable ability to selectively process information in complex environments. This cognitive capability allows people to follow one conversation in a noisy room while unconsciously scanning other conversations for their own name, important topics, or potential threats that might require attention. The effect reveals how attention operates on multiple levels simultaneously, with focused attention dedicated to primary tasks, while background monitoring continues automatically to detect significant information that might warrant shifting focus. Research shows that people can ignore most background conversations, but will immediately notice when their name is mentioned elsewhere, when emergency words like fire are spoken, or when personally meaningful topics arise in nearby discussions. The cocktail party effect extends beyond auditory processing to include visual attention, where people can focus on specific activities while peripherally monitoring for important changes or opportunities in their environment. This selective attention system evolved to help humans navigate complex social and physical environments where multiple streams of information compete for cognitive resources, allowing us to maintain awareness of potential opportunities and threats while concentrating on immediate tasks. Understanding this effect helps explain how we can appear to ignore important information while being absorbed in other activities, and why creating optimal environments for focus requires managing both primary tasks and potential distractions that might capture our automatic monitoring systems. When evaluating behavior and character, people consistently apply different standards to themselves versus others, attributing their own actions to situational factors and good intentions while attributing others' actions to personality traits and character flaws. This fundamental attribution error creates systematic biases in how we understand and judge human behavior, leading to harsher evaluations of others and more forgiving assessments of ourselves. When we arrive late to a meeting, we focus on the unexpected traffic or urgent phone call that delayed us. But when others arrive late, we assume they're disorganized or don't prioritize punctuality. When we make mistakes, we consider the extenuating circumstances and competing priorities that contributed to the error. But when others make similar mistakes, we question their competence or attention to detail. This double standard occurs because we have complete access to our own thoughts, intentions, and circumstances, but can only observe others' external behavior without knowing their internal experience or situational constraints. The error contributes to interpersonal conflicts, workplace tensions, and social judgments that underestimate the power of situations while overestimating the influence of personality and character. However, understanding this bias can improve relationships and communication by encouraging us to extend the same contextual understanding to others that we naturally give ourselves. It reminds us to consider what situational factors might be influencing others' behavior rather than immediately attributing their actions to character defects, while also encouraging us to take appropriate responsibility for our own choices rather than always blaming external circumstances. The moment people take ownership of an object, their psychological attachment and valuation of that item increases dramatically, making them demand much more money to sell it than they would have been willing to pay to buy it. A phenomenon called the mere ownership effect that reveals how possession changes perception. This bias operates independently of any functional benefits of ownership, occurring simply because the item becomes associated with the owner's identity and triggers loss aversion that makes giving it up feel psychologically painful. Research demonstrates the effect using simple experiments where people randomly assigned coffee mugs value them much more highly than people assigned chocolate bars, even though initial preferences between mugs and chocolate were evenly distributed before ownership was established. The ownership effect influences major life decisions such as staying in homes, jobs, or relationships that no longer serve us well because giving them up feels like losing something valuable, rather than making a change that could improve our situation. The bias also affects investment behavior, with people holding losing stocks longer than winning ones because selling feels like accepting a loss rather than making a rational decision about future prospects. Understanding the mere ownership effect helps us recognize when attachment to current possessions or situations might be preventing beneficial changes and encourages more objective evaluation of whether maintaining the status quo truly serves our interests. It also explains why trial periods and money-back guarantees are effective sales strategies, as they allow potential customers to experience ownership and activate the psychological bias toward keeping items rather than returning them. Human psychology gives greater weight to negative experiences, information, and emotions than to positive ones of equal intensity, a negativity bias that affects everything from memory formation and decision-making to relationship satisfaction and life evaluation. This asymmetry means that criticism hurts more than praise feels good, that bad news captures attention more readily than good news, and that negative events are remembered more vividly and longer than positive events of similar significance. The bias evolved as a survival mechanism that helped our ancestors avoid dangers and threats by paying special attention to potentially harmful information. But in modern environments, it can lead to pessimism, anxiety, and undervaluation of positive experiences. Research shows that people need approximately 5 positive interactions to counterbalance the impact of 1 negative interaction in relationships, that negative feedback affects performance and self-esteem more than positive feedback, and that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. The negativity bias influences media consumption, with news organizations focusing on problems and conflicts because audiences pay more attention to negative stories than positive ones, creating information environments that can distort perceptions of actual risk and prevalence of problems. Understanding this bias helps us recognize when our natural focus on negatives might be preventing appreciation of positives and encourages deliberate cultivation of gratitude, optimism, and positive attention that can counterbalance our automatic tendency toward negativity. It also reminds us that positive experiences and feedback require more frequency and intensity to match the psychological impact of negative ones. When processing sequences of information, people consistently show better recall for items at the beginning and end of lists compared to items in the middle, a memory phenomenon called the serial position effect that influences everything from learning and presentations to first impressions and relationship endings. This cognitive pattern consists of 2 components: the primacy effect, where early information receives more attention and rehearsal leading to stronger memory encoding, and the recency effect, where recent information remains active in working memory and is easily accessible for immediate recall. The effect explains why first impressions carry disproportionate weight in social judgments, why the opening and closing arguments in legal cases are considered most important, and why effective presentations emphasize key points at the beginning and end rather than burying them in the middle. In educational settings, students typically remember material covered at the start and finish of classes better than content presented during the middle portions, suggesting that important concepts should be introduced early and reinforced at the end of learning sessions. The serial position effect also influences how we evaluate experiences over time, with the beginnings and endings of relationships, vacations, or projects carrying more weight in overall assessments than the quality of middle periods. Understanding this memory bias helps us structure communication and learning experiences more effectively by placing crucial information in positions where it's most likely to be remembered. It also reminds us that our judgments of sequences and experiences may be disproportionately influenced by how they start and finish rather than their overall quality throughout. Humans consistently overestimate their ability to control or influence outcomes that are actually determined by random chance or factors beyond their direct influence, creating illusions of control that affect decision-making in gambling, investing, relationships, and many other life domains. This psychological bias leads people to believe they can influence dice rolls through throwing technique, improve lottery odds through number selection strategies, or control stock market performance through timing and analysis. The illusion intensifies when people have personal involvement in the process, when they can make choices even if those choices don't actually affect outcomes, and when early attempts appear successful due to random chance. The bias serves important psychological functions by maintaining motivation and reducing anxiety about uncertain outcomes, but it can also lead to overconfidence, excessive risk-taking, and persistent engagement in futile activities. Gamblers develop elaborate systems and rituals believing they can beat games of pure chance. Investors trade frequently thinking they can time markets despite evidence of random walk patterns, and people blame themselves for relationship failures that may have been inevitable due to incompatibility. The illusion of control explains why active participation feels more satisfying than passive observation, even when involvement doesn't improve outcomes, and why delegation can be psychologically difficult for leaders who prefer to maintain hands-on involvement. Understanding this bias helps us distinguish between situations where we have genuine influence and those where perceived control is largely illusory, encouraging appropriate effort allocation while reducing self-blame for outcomes beyond our actual control. When estimating probabilities or making classifications, people rely heavily on how closely an example resembles their mental prototype or stereotype of a category, often ignoring relevant statistical information that would lead to more accurate judgments. This representativeness heuristic leads to systematic errors, such as assuming that random sequences should look random even when clustering is normal, believing that small samples should mirror population characteristics, and judging likelihood based on similarity to familiar examples rather than base rates. The bias manifests when people assume that a person who is quiet and studious is more likely to be a librarian than a salesperson, even though there are far more salespeople than librarians in the population, making the base rate probability much higher for sales. Similarly, people expect coin flips to alternate between heads and tails more than actually occurs randomly, and they assume that basketball players who make several shots in a row are more likely to make the next shot despite each attempt being statistically independent. The representativeness heuristic can lead to neglect of important factors like sample size, regression to the mean, and prior probabilities that are crucial for accurate probability assessment. However, the heuristic also provides useful shortcuts for rapid categorization and pattern recognition that work well in many everyday situations where detailed statistical analysis isn't practical. Understanding this mental shortcut helps us recognize when our intuitive probability judgments might be distorted by surface similarities and encourages consideration of relevant statistical information when making important decisions that depend on accurate probability assessment. Humans possess an innate psychological drive to form and maintain positive relationships with others, a need for belonging that is so fundamental that chronic social isolation creates stress responses similar to physical pain and increases risks for depression, anxiety, and physical health problems. This deep need for connection influences virtually every aspect of human behavior, from the clothes we wear and activities we pursue to the values we adopt and identities we develop, as people constantly seek acceptance and inclusion within meaningful social groups. The belonging need explains why social rejection feels so painful, why people conform to group norms even when they privately disagree, and why ostracism and exclusion are such effective forms of punishment across cultures. Research demonstrates that people with strong social connections live longer, recover from illness more quickly, and show greater resilience during stress than those who lack meaningful relationships, suggesting that belonging serves both psychological and biological functions essential for human thriving. The need manifests differently across individuals and cultures, with some people requiring large social networks, while others find satisfaction in deep one-on-one connections. But virtually everyone needs some form of meaningful human connection to maintain optimal well-being. Modern technology creates new challenges and opportunities for belonging, allowing global connections while potentially reducing face-to-face intimacy that may be necessary for fully satisfying the belonging need. Understanding this fundamental motivation helps explain many social behaviors and reminds us to prioritize relationship building and maintenance as essential components of mental and physical health rather than optional luxuries that can be postponed for other priorities. People often believe that random events that have occurred more frequently than expected will become less likely in the future, or that events that haven't occurred recently are due to happen soon, a mistaken belief called the gambler's fallacy that ignores the independence of random processes. This fallacy leads gamblers to bet on numbers that haven't come up recently in roulette, believing they're due, or to expect that a series of coin flip heads makes tails more likely on the next flip, when in reality, each event has the same probability, regardless of previous outcomes. The bias occurs because humans naturally seek patterns and meaning in random sequences, expecting short-term samples to reflect long-term probabilities, even when insufficient data makes such expectations unrealistic. The gambler's fallacy affects decision-making beyond gambling, influencing everything from sports predictions and investment choices to parenting decisions about family planning after having several children of the same gender. The fallacy can also operate in reverse, called the hot hand fallacy, where people believe that successful streaks will continue indefinitely, leading to overconfidence after a period of good performance. Both versions of the fallacy stem from misunderstanding how randomness actually works, with truly random processes showing more clustering and streaking than people intuitively expect. Understanding these probability misconceptions helps us make better decisions about risk and uncertainty, while avoiding the false belief that we can predict random events based on recent patterns. It reminds us that each independent event starts fresh regardless of what came before, and that apparent patterns in random sequences are usually coincidental rather than meaningful. People consistently interpret their successes as resulting from personal qualities like intelligence, hard work, and skill, while attributing their failures to external factors like bad luck, unfair circumstances, or other people's actions. A self-serving bias that protects self-esteem while potentially preventing accurate self-assessment and learning from mistakes. This asymmetric attribution pattern helps maintain motivation and confidence by allowing people to take credit for positive outcomes while avoiding blame for negative ones. But it can also lead to overconfidence, poor decision-making, and interpersonal conflicts when others see the same events differently. The bias manifests when students attribute good grades to their studying and intelligence but blame poor grades on unfair tests or bad teaching, when athletes credit wins to their skill and preparation but attribute losses to referee bias or opponent luck, or when business leaders take personal credit for company successes while blaming failures on market conditions or employee performance. Self-serving attributions become stronger when outcomes are personally important, when the audience includes people whose opinions matter to us, and when we have time to think about explanations rather than responding immediately. However, the bias can also motivate continued effort by maintaining confidence in personal ability while providing psychological protection from the discouragement that might follow from accepting full responsibility for failures. Understanding this bias helps us recognize when our explanations for events might be distorted by self-protection needs and encourages more balanced assessment of our contributions to both positive and negative outcomes, leading to better learning and more realistic self-knowledge. When people believe they are receiving effective medical treatment, they often experience genuine improvements in symptoms and health outcomes, even when the treatment contains no active therapeutic ingredients, demonstrating the powerful influence that expectations and beliefs can have on physical well-being. This placebo effect occurs through complex interactions between psychological expectations and physiological processes, including the release of natural pain-relieving endorphins, activation of brain regions associated with reward and healing, and changes in immune system functioning that can produce measurable health benefits. The effect is particularly strong for conditions involving pain, mood, and subjective symptoms. But research has documented placebo responses in objective measures like blood pressure, hormone levels, and immune markers, suggesting that mind-body connections are more profound than previously understood. Factors that enhance placebo effects include the perceived credibility of the treatment provider, the elaborateness of the treatment ritual, the cost and complexity of the intervention, and the strength of the patient's belief in its effectiveness. The placebo effect highlights the importance of hope, expectation, and the therapeutic relationship in healing processes, while also demonstrating that the mind's influence on the body extends far beyond conscious awareness. However, placebo responses don't mean that symptoms are imaginary or that people can simply think themselves better, as the physiological changes produced by placebo effects are real and measurable. Understanding the placebo effect encourages appreciation for the role of psychology in health and healing, while maintaining appropriate skepticism about treatments that rely solely on belief rather than proven biological mechanisms. As people acquire more of any good or experience, each additional unit typically provides less additional satisfaction or utility than the previous one, creating a paradox where abundance can lead to diminishing rather than increasing happiness and fulfillment. This principle of declining marginal utility explains why the first slice of pizza tastes amazing, the second is still good, the third is okay, and the fourth might make you feel sick, despite each slice being objectively identical. The pattern applies beyond food consumption to virtually every domain of human experience, including wealth accumulation, where research shows that additional income provides decreasing happiness benefits as people move from poverty to middle class to wealth. The principle helps explain why people often struggle to appreciate good things they have in abundance while craving things that are scarce, and why gratitude practices that focus attention on existing blessings can increase satisfaction more than acquiring additional possessions. Declining marginal utility also affects time allocation, with extended periods devoted to any single activity typically providing less enjoyment per hour than shorter, varied experiences that maintain novelty and appreciation. However, the principle has limitations and exceptions, particularly for experiences that build cumulative value over time, such as learning skills, developing relationships, or creating meaningful work that provides increasing rather than decreasing satisfaction with continued investment. Understanding this economic and psychological principle helps explain why more isn't always better, and suggests strategies for maximizing satisfaction through variety, moderation, and conscious appreciation, rather than simply pursuing quantity or intensity in any single area of life. People consistently overestimate the extent to which others share their opinions, values, and behaviors, assuming that their own perspectives are more common and normal than they actually are, a cognitive bias called the false consensus effect that influences social perception and decision-making in numerous ways. This tendency leads individuals to believe that most other people would make the same choices they make, hold similar political views, enjoy the same activities, and respond to situations in comparable ways, creating illusions of widespread agreement that may not reflect actual diversity of thought and behavior. The effect occurs because we have privileged access to our own reasoning processes and tend to associate with people who share our characteristics, creating biased samples of human behavior that make our own choices seem more typical than they are. The false consensus bias affects everything from political predictions, where people assume their preferred candidates have broader support than polling indicates, to business decisions, where entrepreneurs overestimate market demand for products they personally find appealing. However, The effect also serves important psychological functions by providing social validation for our choices and reducing the anxiety that might come from feeling deviant or unusual in our preferences and behaviors. Understanding this bias helps us recognize when our assumptions about others might be distorted by projection of our own characteristics and encourages seeking out diverse perspectives that reveal the actual range of human thought and behavior. It reminds us that our own viewpoints, while valid and important to us, may be less universal than we naturally assume. A tolerant society faces a fundamental philosophical dilemma. If it tolerates all viewpoints and behaviors without limitation, it must also tolerate intolerant ideologies that seek to destroy tolerance itself, potentially leading to the elimination of the very tolerance that initially allowed those destructive ideas to flourish. This paradox of tolerance suggests that maintaining a truly tolerant society requires some degree of intolerance toward ideas and movements that would eliminate tolerance for others, creating a complex balance between openness and protection of fundamental values. The dilemma appears in debates about free speech, where societies must decide whether to allow hate speech that targets marginalized groups, in immigration policy discussions about cultural integration and value compatibility, and in educational contexts about which ideas deserve equal consideration versus which should be rejected as harmful. The paradox highlights tensions between absolute principles and practical outcomes, suggesting that pure tolerance without boundaries may be self-defeating, while also recognizing that restrictions on tolerance can be misused to suppress legitimate dissent and minority viewpoints. Historical examples include democratic societies that tolerated fascist parties until those parties gained enough power to destroy democracy itself, demonstrating how unlimited tolerance can enable its own destruction. Understanding this paradox helps us think more clearly about the limits and requirements of tolerance, recognizing that preserving inclusive, open societies may require drawing some boundaries around behaviors and ideologies that seek to eliminate inclusion and openness for others. The key insight is that tolerance is not merely passive acceptance, but an active commitment to protecting the conditions that make tolerance possible. Once people learn the outcome of an event, they consistently overestimate how predictable that outcome was beforehand, a cognitive bias called hindsight bias that makes past events seem more inevitable and foreseeable than they actually were at the time. This "I knew it all along" effect leads people to believe they could have predicted election results, stock market crashes, relationship breakups, and other outcomes that were actually quite uncertain when they occurred. The bias operates by reconstructing memories of past predictions and assessments to align with known outcomes, making it difficult to accurately recall how uncertain or surprising events felt before their resolution. Hindsight bias affects learning from experience by making people overconfident about their predictive abilities and less likely to identify the factors that actually contributed to outcomes versus those that merely appear important in retrospect. The effect influences everything from medical diagnoses, where doctors may believe symptoms pointed more clearly to correct diagnoses than they actually did, to legal proceedings, where juries may judge defendants' actions as more obviously negligent after learning about harmful consequences. The bias also impairs decision-making by making people underestimate the inherent uncertainty in future situations that are similar to past events they now view as predictable. Understanding hindsight bias helps us maintain more realistic assessments of our predictive abilities, while encouraging better documentation of initial judgments and reasoning that can be reviewed objectively after outcomes become known. It reminds us that apparent inevitability often reflects the bias of backward-looking analysis rather than genuine foreseeability of complex events. As people develop genuine expertise in any field, they paradoxically become more aware of the vast amount they still don't know, leading truly knowledgeable individuals to express more uncertainty and humility than novices who lack the understanding necessary to recognize their own limitations. This expert's paradox means that advanced practitioners often appear less confident than beginners, not because they know less, but because they understand the complexity and nuance that make definitive statements inappropriate in most situations. The phenomenon explains why scientists hedge their conclusions with qualifications and acknowledge limitations. why master craftspeople see flaws in their work that others cannot detect, and why experienced professionals often express doubt about decisions that seem obvious to less experienced colleagues. The paradox creates communication challenges when experts' appropriate uncertainty is interpreted as incompetence by audiences who expect confident pronouncements, while overconfident novices may seem more credible despite their limited understanding. This dynamic affects public discourse about complex issues like climate change, economics, and health policy, where genuine experts' nuanced positions may be overshadowed by simpler but less accurate claims from less qualified commentators. Understanding this paradox helps us recognize that intellectual humility often indicates greater rather than lesser expertise, and that appropriate uncertainty in complex domains reflects wisdom rather than ignorance. It encourages us to value thoughtful qualification over false certainty and to recognize that the most knowledgeable people are often those who are most aware of what they don't know. While having options is essential for human autonomy and satisfaction, unlimited choice can become paralyzing and counterproductive, suggesting that meaningful freedom requires appropriate constraints and limitations that make decision-making manageable without eliminating genuine alternatives. This refined understanding of choice recognizes that some restrictions actually enhance rather than diminish freedom by providing structure, reducing decision fatigue, and focusing attention on truly important decisions rather than trivial variations. Effective choice architecture involves curating options to include meaningful alternatives while eliminating redundant or overwhelming possibilities that add complexity without adding value. The principle applies to everything from restaurant menus that balance variety with simplicity to career paths that provide clear progression routes rather than unlimited but unclear possibilities, to relationship decisions that benefit from social norms and expectations that guide but don't eliminate personal choice. Organizations and societies that support human flourishing typically provide structured freedom rather than unlimited options, creating frameworks that enable meaningful choice while protecting people from choice overload that can lead to paralysis, regret, and reduced satisfaction. The paradox suggests that the goal should not be maximizing the number of available options, but optimizing the quality and meaningfulness of choices within manageable parameters. Understanding this principle helps us design better decision environments for ourselves and others while recognizing that appropriate limitations can enhance rather than restrict genuine freedom and autonomy. It reminds us that structure and choice are complementary rather than opposing forces in creating satisfying human experiences. While we naturally explain our own behavior in terms of our good intentions, complex circumstances, and internal struggles that others cannot see, we tend to judge other people based primarily on their observable actions and outcomes, creating systematic biases in how we evaluate character and assign responsibility. This asymmetry in attribution occurs because we have complete access to our own thoughts, emotions, and situational pressures, but can only observe others' external behavior without knowing their internal experience or the constraints they face. When we act rudely, we focus on our stress, fatigue, or difficult circumstances that explain our behavior. But when others act rudely, we assume they are inconsiderate or bad-tempered people without considering what pressures they might be experiencing. This double standard contributes to interpersonal conflicts, workplace tensions, and social judgments that underestimate the power of situations while overestimating the influence of personality in determining behavior. The bias becomes particularly problematic in evaluating moral character, where we give ourselves credit for good intentions even when our actions fall short, while judging others primarily on their visible actions regardless of their underlying motivations or constraints. Understanding this asymmetry can improve relationships and communication by encouraging us to extend the same contextual understanding to others that we naturally give ourselves, while also taking appropriate responsibility for our own actions rather than always focusing on our good intentions. It reminds us that everyone is fighting battles we cannot see, and that observable behavior provides incomplete information about character and motivation. Beyond simply valuing things we build ourselves, the effort investment principle extends to any situation where people contribute time, energy, or creativity to outcomes, making them feel more attached to results regardless of objective quality or external evaluation. This psychological phenomenon explains why people become emotionally invested in projects they've worked on, even when those projects are ultimately unsuccessful, why students prefer universities they had to work harder to get into, and why relationships that require more effort often feel more valuable than those that come easily. The effect operates through multiple psychological mechanisms. Effort justification makes people rationalize their work as worthwhile. The completion of challenging tasks provides competence, satisfaction, and the creative process generates ownership feelings that enhance perceived value. However, the effect has important limitations and can become counterproductive when effort investment prevents objective evaluation of results or leads to continued commitment to failing ventures simply because of past work invested. The principle helps explain why collaborative processes that involve stakeholders in solution development often generate more buy-in than top-down implementations, why customization options increase customer satisfaction, and why participatory decision-making creates stronger commitment than authoritarian directives. Understanding the effort attachment relationship suggests that involving people in creating solutions to their own problems often generates more commitment and satisfaction than providing ready-made answers, while also recognizing when emotional attachment to past effort might be preventing rational assessment of current options and future possibilities. While authenticity suggests being natural and unfiltered, genuine authenticity actually requires deliberate self-awareness, conscious choice, and ongoing effort to understand and express one's true values and character rather than simply acting on immediate impulses or social conditioning. This paradox reveals that what feels natural or spontaneous may actually reflect unconscious habits, social pressures, or reactive patterns rather than authentic self-expression rooted in genuine self-knowledge and intentional choice. True authenticity involves the challenging work of examining our motivations, understanding our core values, and making conscious decisions about how to express our genuine selves in different contexts and relationships. The process requires distinguishing between authentic emotions and reactions versus automatic responses shaped by past experiences, social expectations, or unconscious fears that may not reflect our deeper truth. Authenticity also involves the courage to express genuine thoughts and feelings even when they're uncomfortable or socially challenging, while also developing the wisdom to choose appropriate times and ways for authentic self-expression that honor both personal truth and relational responsibility. The paradox suggests that becoming authentic is an active, ongoing process rather than a passive state of being, requiring continuous self-reflection and conscious choice rather than simply doing whatever feels natural in the moment. Understanding this complexity helps us approach authenticity as a practice rather than an achievement, recognizing that genuine self-expression requires both courage and wisdom, spontaneity and reflection, individual truth and social awareness. Human memory systematically edits past experiences to emphasize positive elements while minimizing negative aspects, creating nostalgia that makes previous times seem better than they actually were when we lived through them. This rosy retrospection occurs because our brains naturally fade negative memories faster than positive ones, while also reconstructing past events in ways that support current identity and well-being, rather than maintaining perfect accuracy about how things felt at the time. The nostalgia effect helps explain why people often long for previous decades, relationships, or life stages that they may have found stressful or unsatisfying when actually experiencing them, and why each generation tends to believe that things were better in the past despite objective evidence of progress in many areas. The bias can create unrealistic standards for present experiences by comparing them to idealized memories of past events, leading to perpetual dissatisfaction with current circumstances that can never match the edited highlights of memory. However, nostalgia also serves important psychological functions by providing comfort during difficult times, strengthening identity and continuity across life changes, and creating positive emotional resources that support resilience and well-being. The effect influences everything from consumer preferences for retro products and traditional practices to political appeals that promise to restore imagined golden ages that may never have actually existed. Understanding the nostalgia effect helps us appreciate happy memories while maintaining realistic perspectives about past and present experiences. Recognizing that selective memory can both comfort and mislead us about the relative quality of different time periods in our lives. Efforts at self-improvement often become self-defeating when they're driven by self-rejection and the assumption that we need to be fundamentally different than we are, creating internal conflict that impedes the very growth and change we're seeking to achieve. This paradox suggests that sustainable personal development requires accepting ourselves as we are while simultaneously working toward growth, balancing self-compassion with motivation for change in ways that honor both our current reality and our aspirations for the future. The tension arises because aggressive self-improvement efforts often stem from shame, comparison with others, or rejection of aspects of ourselves that may actually be valuable or unchangeable, leading to internal resistance that sabotages progress and creates cycles of effort and disappointment. Effective personal growth typically requires understanding and working with our natural patterns and tendencies rather than fighting against them, finding ways to channel existing traits in more productive directions rather than trying to eliminate them entirely. The paradox also highlights how self-improvement can become a form of procrastination from living fully in the present, with endless focus on becoming better, preventing appreciation and utilization of current strengths and capabilities. Sustainable change often emerges from self-acceptance and curiosity about our patterns rather than harsh self-criticism and forced transformation attempts that create internal rebellion. Understanding this paradox suggests approaching personal development with gentleness and patience, recognizing that authentic growth often requires embracing rather than rejecting aspects of ourselves while creating supportive conditions for natural evolution rather than demanding immediate dramatic change. Humans have a deep psychological need to feel that their actions and decisions stem from personal choice and self-determination rather than external pressure or control, with perceived autonomy serving as a crucial factor in motivation, satisfaction, and psychological well-being across all areas of life. This fundamental need explains why people often resist good advice when it feels imposed, why micromanagement decreases performance even when the manager's suggestions are helpful, and why giving people choices about how to accomplish goals typically improves outcomes compared to dictating specific methods. The autonomy need doesn't require complete freedom from constraints or influences, but rather the feeling that we have some degree of choice and voice in decisions that affect us, even when options are limited by practical considerations or organizational requirements. Research demonstrates that people perform better, persist longer, and report greater satisfaction when they feel their actions are self-chosen rather than externally controlled, even when the actual behaviors are identical in both conditions. The need for autonomy explains why effective leadership involves providing direction and support while preserving followers' sense of choice and input, why successful relationships balance interdependence with individual freedom, and why educational and therapeutic approaches work better when they support rather than override people's own motivation and decision-making. However, autonomy exists in relationship with other needs like competence and connection, requiring balance rather than absolute independence that ignores our inherent interdependence and need for guidance and support from others. Understanding the autonomy need helps us create environments and relationships that honor people's self-determination while providing necessary structure and direction. The more directly and desperately people pursue happiness as a goal, the more elusive it often becomes, suggesting that well-being emerges more reliably as a byproduct of meaningful activity, genuine relationships, and value-aligned behavior rather than from focused efforts to feel happy. This paradox occurs because happiness is largely an emotional response to circumstances and activities rather than something that can be achieved through direct pursuit, much like how trying to fall asleep often prevents sleep while engaging in sleep-conducive activities allows it to occur naturally. The pursuit of happiness can become self-defeating when it creates pressure to feel positive emotions, leads to constant evaluation of emotional states, or causes people to avoid necessary but temporarily unpleasant experiences that contribute to long-term well-being. Research suggests that people who focus on meaningful goals, authentic relationships, and contributing to something beyond themselves often experience more consistent happiness than those who make feeling good their primary objective. The paradox also reveals how cultural emphasis on happiness as the ultimate goal can create unrealistic expectations and self-criticism when natural emotional fluctuations occur, leading to additional suffering layered on top of normal life challenges. However, this doesn't mean that well-being is unimportant or that we should ignore emotional health, but rather that happiness typically emerges from living in accordance with our values and engaging fully with life rather than from making feeling good our primary focus. Understanding this paradox encourages indirect approaches to well-being that emphasize meaning, growth, connection, and contribution, while allowing happiness to arise naturally from these fulfilling activities. Genuine vulnerability, rather than representing weakness or failure, often requires tremendous courage and inner strength, demonstrating confidence secure enough to acknowledge limitations and humanity, brave enough to risk connection despite potential judgment or rejection. This paradox reveals that people who can admit mistakes, ask for help, express uncertainty, and share struggles often possess greater emotional maturity and self-awareness than those who maintain facades of constant competence and invulnerability. Vulnerability creates deeper connections by allowing others to see our authentic humanity, making relationships more meaningful and intimate than interactions based on projected perfection that keeps people at emotional distance. The strength required for vulnerability includes the courage to face potential rejection, the self-awareness to recognize and acknowledge our limitations, and the wisdom to understand that genuine connection requires mutual openness rather than one-sided impression management. However, healthy vulnerability requires discernment about appropriate timing, context, and audiences, as sharing too much too quickly or with unsuitable people can indeed lead to harm or exploitation. The paradox suggests that true confidence comes not from having no weaknesses, but from being secure enough to acknowledge the weaknesses we do have, while understanding that our imperfections often make us more relatable and trustworthy rather than less valuable or worthy of respect. Effective vulnerability involves sharing struggles and limitations in ways that invite connection and understanding rather than seeking sympathy or avoiding responsibility, creating opportunities for mutual support and authentic relationship building. While humans naturally desire control over their circumstances and outcomes, attempts to micromanage every aspect of life often create resistance, stress, and counterproductive results. Whereas accepting what cannot be controlled while focusing energy on what can be influenced typically leads to better outcomes and greater peace of mind. This paradox of control operates because excessive control attempts often ignore the complex, interconnected nature of systems where forcing one element can create unexpected consequences elsewhere, while rigid control strategies prevent the flexibility and adaptation necessary for navigating changing circumstances effectively. In relationships, trying to control others' behavior typically creates resistance and conflict, while accepting people as they are and focusing on our own responses often improves interactions and allows natural positive changes to emerge. The principle applies to parenting, where overprotective control can prevent children from developing necessary independence and resilience, and to leadership, where micromanagement often reduces rather than improves team performance and innovation. The paradox doesn't suggest passive resignation or abandoning all efforts to influence outcomes, but rather developing wisdom about where to apply effort most effectively while accepting uncertainty and uncontrollable factors as natural parts of life. This approach typically reduces stress and anxiety while increasing effectiveness, as energy goes toward actionable items rather than being wasted on futile attempts to control unchangeable circumstances. Understanding this paradox helps us distinguish between healthy influence and unhealthy control, encouraging responses that work with natural forces rather than against them, while maintaining appropriate responsibility for our choices and actions. While certainty feels psychologically comfortable and provides illusions of security and control, maintaining openness to uncertainty and acknowledging what we don't know often leads to better decisions, continued learning, and more accurate understanding of complex situations that resist simple explanations. This wisdom of uncertainty recognizes that many important questions don't have clear answers, that knowledge is provisional and evolving, and that intellectual humility typically produces better outcomes than false confidence based on incomplete information. Embracing uncertainty allows for curiosity and exploration rather than defensive protection of existing beliefs, creating space for new information and perspectives that can improve our understanding and decision-making over time. The principle applies to scientific inquiry, where acknowledging uncertainty drives continued research and discovery, to leadership, where admitting limitations encourages consultation and collaborative problem-solving, and to personal growth, where accepting that we don't have all the answers allows for continued learning and development. However, uncertainty tolerance must be balanced with the practical need to make decisions and take actions even when information is incomplete, requiring skills in decision-making under uncertainty rather than paralysis from lack of complete knowledge. The wisdom involves distinguishing between uncertainty that should motivate further inquiry and uncertainty that must be accepted as inherent to complex situations, while developing comfort with provisional conclusions that can be revised as new information becomes available. Understanding this principle helps us navigate complexity with appropriate humility while maintaining the confidence needed for effective action and decision-making in uncertain environments. The relentless pursuit of perfection frequently becomes the enemy of excellence, creating paralysis, procrastination, and all-or-nothing thinking that prevents completion of projects and achievement of goals that would be valuable even if not perfect. This paradox occurs because perfectionism often stems from fear of criticism or failure rather than genuine commitment to quality, leading to standards so impossibly high that they discourage rather than motivate progress and improvement. Perfectionist thinking can prevent people from starting projects because they fear not being able to complete them perfectly, from finishing work because it doesn't meet unrealistic standards, and from sharing accomplishments because they focus on flaws rather than overall value and achievement. The pursuit of perfection also ignores the reality that most worthwhile endeavors involve iteration, learning from mistakes, and gradual improvement over time rather than getting everything right on the first attempt. Excellence, in contrast to perfection, involves doing your best work given current constraints and capabilities while remaining open to feedback and continued improvement rather than demanding flawless performance that may be impossible or unnecessary. The paradox suggests that accepting good enough in some areas allows focus and energy for excellence in areas that truly matter, while perfectionism spreads effort so thinly across unrealistic standards that nothing reaches its potential. Understanding this distinction helps us set appropriate standards that motivate progress rather than creating paralysis, while recognizing that done is often better than perfect when it comes to completing meaningful work and achieving important goals. Authentic strength encompasses not only the ability to stand firm and persevere through challenges, but also the wisdom to know when gentleness, flexibility, and strategic yielding serve better than rigid resistance or aggressive force. This nuanced understanding of strength recognizes that different situations call for different responses, with true power lying in the ability to choose appropriate responses rather than defaulting to one-size-fits-all approaches that may be counterproductive. Physical strength includes both the capacity to exert force and the control to moderate that force appropriately, while emotional strength involves both resilience in the face of adversity and sensitivity to respond compassionately when others need support. The paradox appears in leadership, where effective authority requires both confidence to make difficult decisions and humility to listen to feedback and change course when necessary, and in relationships, where healthy boundaries must be balanced with openness and compromise. True strength often manifests as restraint rather than display, choosing not to use power we possess when gentler approaches would be more effective or appropriate for the situation and relationships involved. The principle suggests that strength without wisdom can become destructiveness, while wisdom without strength can become ineffectiveness. requiring integration of power and discernment for optimal outcomes. Understanding this paradox helps us develop more sophisticated approaches to challenges that consider not only what we're capable of doing, but what we should do given the full context of situations and the long-term consequences of our choices for ourselves and others. The ability to explain complex ideas simply or create elegant solutions to complicated problems typically requires deep understanding of underlying complexity rather than superficial knowledge that glosses over important nuances and details. This paradox of simplicity suggests that true clarity emerges from thoroughly grasping complexity rather than avoiding it, with the most profound insights often expressed in the most accessible ways by those who have mastered the intricacies involved. Effective teachers make difficult concepts understandable not by dumbing them down, but by understanding them so well that they can identify the essential elements and present them in ways that build understanding progressively from simple foundations to more sophisticated applications. The principle applies to design, where elegant user interfaces typically require complex underlying systems that handle complicated processes seamlessly, and to communication, where clear explanations often result from extensive preparation and deep knowledge rather than superficial treatment of topics. However, the paradox warns against mistaking simplicity for simplism, recognizing that appropriate simplification honors complexity while making it accessible, whereas oversimplification distorts reality by ignoring important factors that affect understanding and outcomes. The goal is not to make everything simple, but to find the appropriate level of complexity for each situation and audience, providing enough detail for accurate understanding while avoiding unnecessary complication that obscures rather than clarifies essential points. Understanding this paradox helps us appreciate the skill required to communicate complex ideas clearly, while avoiding both incomprehensible jargon and misleading oversimplification that fails to convey important nuances. Many people discover upon achieving long-sought goals that the accomplishment doesn't provide the satisfaction or fulfillment they expected, revealing a paradox where success can lead to disappointment rather than joy if the goals pursued weren't aligned with deeper values and authentic desires. This phenomenon occurs because goals are often adopted from external expectations, social pressures, or assumptions about what should make us happy, rather than emerging from genuine self-knowledge about what actually brings meaning and satisfaction to our individual lives. The hedonic treadmill effect contributes to this paradox, as people adapt quickly to improved circumstances and return to baseline happiness levels, making achievements feel less significant than anticipated while creating pressure to pursue even larger goals that may also prove unsatisfying. Additionally, the process of pursuing goals often involves sacrifices of time, relationships, health, or other values that may ultimately matter more than the achievement itself, leading to Pyrrhic victories that accomplish objectives while undermining overall well-being. The paradox suggests that success is best defined not by external achievements, but by alignment between our actions and deeper values, with fulfillment coming more from the process of meaningful pursuit than from reaching specific destinations. Understanding this paradox encourages careful consideration of why we want particular outcomes, and whether the pursuit itself honors our authentic values and contributes to our genuine well-being, rather than simply meeting expectations or comparing ourselves to others. It reminds us that true success involves both achieving worthwhile goals and ensuring that the pursuit enhances rather than diminishes our humanity and relationships along the way. Counter to intuitive assumptions about speed and efficiency, deliberately slowing down and exercising patience often leads to faster progress and better outcomes than rushing toward goals with frantic urgency that creates mistakes, oversight, and counterproductive actions. This paradox of patience operates because taking time for careful planning, thorough preparation, and thoughtful execution typically prevents errors that would require time-consuming corrections later, while hasty approaches often create problems that take longer to fix than the original task would have required with proper attention. The principle applies to learning, where allowing time for reflection and integration produces deeper understanding that accelerates future learning, to relationships, where patient listening and gradual trust building creates stronger connections than aggressive pursuit, and to problem solving, where careful analysis often reveals efficient solutions that aren't apparent under pressure. Patience also allows for recognition of optimal timing and favorable conditions rather than forcing action when circumstances aren't conducive to success, leading to better results with less effort when actions are taken at appropriate moments. However, the paradox requires distinguishing between productive patience that involves active preparation and strategic waiting versus passive procrastination that avoids necessary action indefinitely. The wisdom involves understanding when patience serves progress and when action is required, developing sensitivity to natural rhythms and timing that support rather than hinder achievement of meaningful goals. Understanding this paradox helps us resist cultural pressures for constant urgency while developing the temporal wisdom to know when slowing down accelerates progress and when quick action is genuinely required for optimal outcomes. While people naturally want to help others by offering solutions and suggestions, the most valuable guidance often emerges not from giving advice, but from listening deeply and asking thoughtful questions that help people discover their own insights and answers. This paradox occurs because external advice, no matter how wise, often doesn't fit the unique circumstances, values, and constraints that only the person facing the situation fully understands, while self-discovered solutions typically have stronger commitment and implementation because they emerge from personal understanding rather than imposed suggestions. Effective helping involves creating space for people to think through their challenges aloud, explore their options, and tap into their own wisdom rather than immediately jumping to solutions that may not address the real underlying issues or may ignore important factors that aren't apparent to outside observers. The process of articulating problems and exploring feelings often clarifies thinking and reveals solutions that were already present but not yet conscious, making the helper's role more about facilitating discovery than providing answers. However, the paradox doesn't eliminate the value of sharing knowledge, experience, and perspectives when specifically requested or clearly relevant, but rather emphasizes the importance of understanding what kind of support people actually need rather than assuming they want our solutions. The principle applies to parenting, where asking children thoughtful questions often develops their problem-solving abilities better than immediately providing answers, and to leadership, where developing others' capabilities requires patience with their learning process rather than efficiency through constant direction. Understanding this paradox helps us become more helpful by focusing on empowerment rather than dependency, support rather than control. As knowledge and understanding deepen in any field, the expanding awareness of complexity and nuance reveals vast territories of ignorance that were invisible from simpler perspectives, creating the humbling realization that learning often increases rather than decreases our sense of how much remains unknown. This knowledge paradox explains why beginners often feel more confident about their understanding than experts do, as limited knowledge provides the illusion of comprehensive understanding, while deeper study reveals layers of complexity, exceptions, and unanswered questions that weren't apparent from surface-level familiarity. The phenomenon creates a relationship between wisdom and humility, where genuine expertise includes accurate assessment of the boundaries and limitations of current knowledge, rather than overconfident claims about understanding that may be premature or oversimplified. This expanding awareness of ignorance serves important functions by maintaining curiosity and motivation for continued learning, preventing premature closure on complex questions, and encouraging appropriate caution in making claims or decisions based on incomplete information. The paradox suggests that intellectual growth involves not just accumulating facts, but developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of what we don't know and why those gaps matter for accurate comprehension and effective action. However, the growing awareness of ignorance must be balanced with confidence in knowledge that is well established and useful, avoiding paralysis from recognizing uncertainty while maintaining appropriate humility about the limits of current understanding. Understanding this paradox helps us embrace learning as an ongoing process rather than a destination, appreciating both what we've learned and what remains to be discovered while maintaining intellectual humility that supports continued growth and understanding. Time presents a fundamental paradox where individual moments feel fleeting and insignificant as we experience them. Yet these same brief moments create all of our memories, shape our identities, and constitute the entirety of our lived experience. This temporal contradiction means that what feels most temporary and disposable in the present becomes the permanent foundation of our past, with ordinary moments often becoming our most treasured memories, while experiences we thought would be unforgettable sometimes fade into insignificance. The paradox reveals how poor humans are at predicting which experiences will matter most in retrospect, leading us to often rush through daily life while waiting for special occasions that may ultimately feel less meaningful than simple moments of connection, beauty, or presence that we barely noticed at the time. Understanding this temporal irony suggests that attention to present experience is crucial, not just for immediate well-being, but for creating the positive memories that will sustain us in the future, while also recognizing that every moment offers opportunities for meaning and connection that may seem small but can have lasting impact. The paradox also highlights how memory reconstructs rather than simply records experience, with present emotions and perspectives coloring how we remember past events in ways that make time feel fluid rather than linear. This awareness encourages both presence in current moments and patience with how our understanding of experiences evolves over time, recognizing that significance often emerges gradually rather than being immediately apparent in the moment of experience. Genuine intimacy and meaningful relationships require individuals to first develop comfort with solitude and secure sense of self, creating a paradox where the capacity for deep connection depends on the ability to be authentically present without needing others to complete or validate us. This relationship paradox occurs because people who are desperate for connection often approach relationships from neediness and insecurity that creates pressure and inauthenticity, while those who are secure in themselves can offer genuine presence and vulnerability that invites real intimacy. The principle suggests that healthy relationships involve two whole people choosing to share their lives rather than two incomplete people trying to use each other to fill internal voids that can never be satisfied externally. Comfort with solitude allows for honest self-reflection, development of personal interests and values, and the emotional regulation skills necessary for navigating the challenges that arise in close relationships without becoming overwhelmed or reactive. However, the paradox doesn't advocate for complete independence or isolation, but rather for the self-awareness and emotional security that makes interdependence possible without codependence that diminishes both individuals' autonomy and growth. The balance involves developing sufficient inner resources and self-knowledge to contribute meaningfully to relationships while remaining open to the growth and vulnerability that genuine connection requires. Understanding this paradox helps us approach relationships from abundance rather than scarcity, offering our authentic selves while appreciating others for who they are rather than what they can provide for us, creating foundations for sustainable intimacy and mutual support. Authentic wisdom encompasses not only accumulated knowledge and experience, but also clear recognition of the boundaries and limitations of our understanding, creating a paradox where the wisest people are often those most aware of how much they don't know and most cautious about claiming certainty in complex situations. This humble wisdom emerges from sufficient experience to recognize patterns while also encountering enough exceptions, complications, and surprises to understand that reality often defies simple explanations and confident predictions. Wise individuals typically express appropriate uncertainty about complex issues, acknowledge multiple perspectives on contentious topics, and remain open to changing their minds when presented with compelling evidence that challenges their current understanding. The paradox suggests that intellectual maturity involves moving beyond the confidence of limited knowledge toward the humility of broader perspective that recognizes complexity, ambiguity, and the provisional nature of most human understanding. However, this recognition of uncertainty must be balanced with the confidence needed to make decisions and take actions based on best available information, avoiding paralysis from recognizing limitations while maintaining appropriate caution about overconfident claims. wisdom also includes knowing when to act despite incomplete information and when to seek additional understanding before proceeding, developing practical judgment that honors both what we know and what we don't know about important decisions. Understanding this paradox helps us appreciate intellectual humility as a sign of strength rather than weakness, while developing the discernment to distinguish between appropriate confidence and dangerous overconfidence in our understanding of complex situations. Sustainable personal and social change often requires first accepting current reality completely, including aspects we wish were different, creating a paradox where resistance to what exists can prevent the very transformation we seek, while full acceptance of present circumstances can enable natural growth and evolution. This change paradox occurs because fighting against current reality typically creates internal tension and external resistance that consume energy needed for actual improvement, while accepting what is allows clear assessment of starting points and realistic planning for beneficial modifications. The principle applies to personal development, where self-acceptance provides the secure foundation needed for authentic growth, and to social change, where understanding existing systems fully enables more effective interventions than idealistic approaches that ignore current constraints and motivations. Acceptance doesn't mean passive resignation or approval of problematic situations, but rather clear-eyed recognition of current conditions that allows for strategic and effective responses rather than reactive opposition that may be counterproductive. The paradox suggests that what we resist often persists, while what we accept with awareness can transform naturally, as acceptance reduces the emotional charge that often keeps us stuck in unproductive patterns of opposition and complaint. However, acceptance must be balanced with appropriate action and boundary setting that honor both current reality and desired outcomes, avoiding both denial that prevents necessary change and premature action that lacks sufficient understanding of existing conditions. Understanding this paradox helps us approach change with greater wisdom and effectiveness, recognizing that transformation often begins with radical acceptance of what exists while maintaining clear intention for beneficial growth and improvement. Authentic freedom emerges not from the absence of all limitations, but from the conscious choice of constraints that align with our deeper values and long-term well-being, creating a paradox where self-imposed discipline and commitment often provide more genuine liberty than unlimited options without direction. This freedom paradox recognizes that complete absence of constraints typically leads to paralysis, dissipation of energy across too many possibilities, and lack of meaningful progress toward important goals, while thoughtfully chosen limitations can focus effort and create sustainable structures for achievement and fulfillment. The principle appears in creative work, where artists often produce their best work within formal constraints that channel creativity rather than unlimited freedom that can lead to overwhelming possibilities, and in personal development, where consistent habits and routines create the stability needed for growth and accomplishment. Healthy constraints include commitments to relationships that limit other romantic options while providing depth and intimacy, professional responsibilities that restrict time while enabling meaningful contribution, and personal values that eliminate certain choices while clarifying important decisions. However, the paradox requires wisdom in choosing which constraints serve our authentic purposes versus which limitations are imposed externally or stem from fear rather than conscious choice. The goal involves discerning between constraints that enhance our capacity for meaningful action and those that diminish our genuine autonomy and self-expression. Understanding this paradox helps us approach freedom as conscious choice-making rather than unlimited options, recognizing that strategic self-limitation often enables greater achievement and satisfaction than attempts to keep all possibilities open indefinitely. Genuine peace and tranquility arise not from eliminating challenges, conflicts, and difficulties from our lives, but from developing the inner resources and perspective needed to remain centered and grounded while navigating inevitable turbulence with grace and wisdom. This peace paradox suggests that attempts to create perfect external conditions often fail to provide lasting serenity because life naturally includes uncertainty, loss, conflict, and change that cannot be permanently avoided or controlled. True peace involves cultivating inner stability that persists through external fluctuations, developing equanimity that allows us to respond rather than react to challenging circumstances while maintaining connection to deeper values and purposes that transcend temporary difficulties. The principle recognizes that peace built on avoidance of problems is fragile and unsustainable, while peace that emerges from engaging skillfully with life's challenges becomes increasingly robust and reliable over time. This doesn't mean seeking unnecessary drama or conflict, but rather accepting that meaningful lives inevitably include difficulties that can become opportunities for growth, learning, and deeper understanding when approached with appropriate resources and perspective. The paradox suggests that peace is more about how we relate to our experiences than about controlling what experiences we have, with serenity emerging from acceptance, wisdom, and inner development rather than from perfect external circumstances. However, this internal focus must be balanced with appropriate action to address changeable problems and create supportive conditions for well-being, avoiding both ineffective attempts to control everything and passive resignation that ignores opportunities for beneficial change. Understanding this paradox helps us develop more sustainable approaches to peace and happiness that don't depend on impossible perfection in our external circumstances. Genuine gratitude for current circumstances and possessions often creates psychological and practical conditions that increase our capacity to recognize, receive, and create additional positive experiences, while constant focus on what's missing or inadequate can blind us to existing blessings and opportunities for improvement. This gratitude paradox operates through multiple mechanisms. Appreciation shifts attention toward positive aspects of life that were previously overlooked. Grateful attitudes attract others who want to share in positive energy and contribute to our well-being. And acknowledgement of current gifts creates emotional abundance that motivates generous actions that often return unexpected benefits. The principle doesn't suggest passive acceptance of inadequate conditions or naive optimism about serious problems, but rather recognition that appreciation for existing positives provides better foundation for addressing difficulties than constant complaint and dissatisfaction that drain energy and distort perception. Gratitude also enhances present moment experience by directing attention toward what's working rather than what's missing, creating more enjoyable daily life regardless of external circumstances, while also building psychological resources needed for resilience during challenging times. However, authentic gratitude requires honesty about both positives and negatives rather than forced positivity that denies real problems or legitimate concerns that need attention and action. The balance involves appreciating good things while also working to address problems, recognizing that gratitude for current conditions can coexist with motivation for beneficial changes. Understanding this paradox helps us approach life with abundance mentality that recognizes existing gifts while remaining open to growth and improvement, creating upward spirals of appreciation and positive experience that enhance both current satisfaction and future possibilities. Understanding our authentic identity often emerges through process of elimination and contrast, where experiences of what doesn't fit, feel authentic, or align with our deeper nature help clarify what does resonate with our true self. This identity paradox suggests that self-discovery involves not only exploring potential interests and characteristics, but also recognizing and releasing aspects of ourselves that were adopted from external expectations, social pressures, or past circumstances that no longer serve our authentic expression. The process often includes periods of trying on different roles, relationships, and activities that may ultimately be discarded, but provide valuable information about preferences, values, and natural inclinations that guide us toward more authentic choices. Identity development also involves distinguishing between core aspects of self that remain relatively stable over time and surface-level characteristics that naturally evolve with experience and growth, avoiding both rigid attachment to fixed self-concepts and complete fluidity that lacks consistent direction. The paradox recognizes that healthy identity includes both continuity and change, with authentic self-expression requiring ongoing attention to what feels true and meaningful rather than automatic adherence to past self-definitions or current social expectations. However, the exploration process requires patience and self-compassion, as discovering authentic identity often involves mistakes, false starts, and periods of uncertainty that are natural parts of development rather than signs of failure or inadequacy. Understanding this paradox helps us approach identity formation as an ongoing creative process rather than a problem to be solved once, remaining open to continued discovery while honoring what we've learned about ourselves through both positive and negative experiences. Deep meaning and purpose in life typically arise not from self-focused pursuits of personal happiness or success, but from contributing to causes, relationships, and values that extend beyond individual concerns and connect us to larger purposes that transcend our limited perspectives. This meaning paradox suggests that purely self-centered approaches to fulfillment often feel empty despite achieving personal goals, while dedication to serving others, contributing to community, or advancing meaningful causes provides satisfaction and purpose that persist through difficulties and setbacks. The principle operates because humans are fundamentally social beings whose well-being depends on connection and contribution to collective flourishing, with individual meaning emerging from understanding how our unique gifts and circumstances can serve broader purposes that matter beyond personal benefit. However, service to others must emerge from genuine care and authentic contribution rather than self-sacrifice that ignores personal needs or obligation that breeds resentment, requiring integration of self-care with other care that sustains rather than depletes our capacity for meaningful contribution. The paradox doesn't eliminate the importance of personal development and individual fulfillment, but rather suggests that these are best achieved through engagement with purposes larger than ourselves that provide context and direction for personal growth. Meaningful service often involves developing our capabilities not for their own sake, but to increase our capacity to contribute effectively to what matters most to us and our communities. Understanding this paradox helps us approach meaning-making by asking not only what we want, but how we can contribute, recognizing that purpose often emerges from intersection of personal strengths, authentic values, and genuine needs in the world that call for our unique response. Despite obvious differences in culture, circumstances, appearance, and beliefs, all humans share remarkably similar core needs for love, belonging, meaning, security, and growth that transcend superficial distinctions and create common ground for understanding and connection across apparent divisions. This fundamental unity reveals that beneath the varied expressions of human experience lie universal patterns of motivation, emotion, and aspiration that make empathy and compassion possible even when specific experiences differ dramatically. The recognition includes understanding that everyone struggles with fear, uncertainty, loss, and disappointment while also seeking joy, connection, purpose, and peace in ways that may look different but serve similar psychological and spiritual needs. This shared humanity means that apparent enemies or strangers often face similar internal challenges and desires, with differences in expression reflecting circumstances and cultural conditioning rather than fundamentally different natures or motivations. However, acknowledging universal human experience doesn't eliminate the importance of understanding and respecting cultural differences, individual uniqueness, and diverse perspectives that enrich our collective understanding and capabilities. The unity principle suggests that recognizing our common humanity can serve as foundation for bridging differences while also honoring the diversity that makes human experience rich and complex. Understanding this unity helps reduce judgmental attitudes and increase compassion by recognizing that everyone is doing their best to navigate the universal human experience of being finite beings, seeking infinite things like perfect love, complete security, and ultimate meaning that remain always partially beyond our grasp while motivating continued growth and connection.